Story 1. The Sugary Start. Why Apothecaries Turn to Sweets Section 1. The bitter beginning. Close your eyes, if you haven't already, and imagine a narrow London street in the year 17. The cobblestones are slick with a recent drizzle, and the morning fog hasn't fully lifted. You are walking past a row of timber-framed shop fronts, their signs creaking gently in the damp breeze. One sign, painted in fading gold leaf, depicts a mortar and pestle, and beneath it, the words, Thomas Grindal, apothecary, established 1715. A bell above the door jingles as you push it open, and the first thing that meets you is not the pungent sting of ammonia or the sharp bite of vinegar, as you might expect from a place that dispenses medicine, but a warm, almost inviting sweetness. It hangs in the air like the memory of a fairground, a gentle perfume of honey, anise, and something floral that you cannot quite name. This is the world of the 18th century English apothecary, a man caught between the grim realities of pre-modern medicine and accidental, almost begrudging artistry. You are here not because you are gravely ill, but because you have a persistent cough that has kept your neighbours awake, and your mother-in-law swears by Grindal's pectoral lozenges. You hand over a few copper coins, and he passes you a small, folded paper packet. Inside, you find a row of small, amber-coloured discs, glossy and faintly translucent, like boiled sweets from the confectioner's stall. They are, in fact, boiled sweets, but with a twist. They contain a tincture of horehound and licorice root, along with a generous dose of refined sugar from the Caribbean. You pop one into your mouth, and as it slowly dissolves, you feel the soothing trickle of syrup coat your throat. It works. It tastes like a treat. And that, dear listener, is the quiet revolution that changed the face of pharmacy forever. But let us step back, away from that warm shop, and into the kitchen of an apothecary a century earlier. There, you would have found a very different scene. Cauldrons bubbling with noxious fumes, shelves lined with dried toads, powdered mummy, and terra sigillata. Clay stamped with a seal that was supposed to cure plague. The medicines were bitter, acrid, and often violently purgative. Patients dreaded them. They would swallow a draught of wormwood or aloe only to retch it back up, or they would refuse to take it entirely, preferring their illness to the cure. This was a crisis for the trade. A remedy that stays in the jar is a remedy that earns no money. So, slowly, over the early decades of the 1700s, a new philosophy crept into the apothecary's back room. If you cannot make it pleasant, you cannot make it profit. The key ingredient in this transformation was not a rare herb from the Orient, nor a new chemical discovery from the Royal Society. It was sugar. And not just any sugar, refined sugar, or white sugar, which had been a luxury for the elite in the Tudor period, but, by the 1720s, was becoming surprisingly affordable, thanks to the brutal efficiency of colonial plantations in Barbados and Jamaica. Shipments arrived weekly at the docks of Bristol and London, and barrels of crystallized sweetness began to overflow into the hands of grocers, confectioners, and, crucially, apothecaries. Thomas Grindal, like many of his peers, would buy sugar by the hundredweight, not for baking, but for coating. He discovered that a strong decoction of cinchona bark, used to treat fevers, could be boiled down with sugar syrup into a thick paste, then rolled into little pellets that dried into hard, lozenge-like drops. The bitterness was still there, but it was muffled, nestled inside a shell that tasted of caramel and butter. Patients began asking for more. They came not because they were sick, but because they remembered the taste. Now, let us pause and consider the daily routine inside that shop. You, as a visitor in 1742, would have observed Grindal behind his long oak counter, dressed not in a white coat. That was a 19th century invention, but in a simple linen apron over a woolen waistcoat. He is not a physician. He is a tradesman. He has no medical degree, only a 7-year apprenticeship under a master apothecary, during which he learned to identify some 200 plants, compound pens, decoct syrups, and, most importantly, keep meticulous written records of every transaction. His hands are stained with turmeric and gentian root, and he constantly wipes them on his apron, leaving faint yellow streaks. He weighs out ingredients on a brass balance scale, the pans swaying gently as he tips in crushed jujubes and powdered marshmallow root. He hums a folk song under his breath, something about a sailor's farewell, and he works with the meditative rhythm of a man who has repeated these motions 10,000 times. But his true skill lies not in the weighing, but in the boiling. In a small back kitchen, visible through a half-open door, you see a copper pan over a low coal fire. Inside the pan, a viscous amber liquid is bubbling lazily. This is his syrup of poppies, a gentle sedative mixture of Papaver somniferum and honey, boiled down until it reaches the pearl stage, where a drop of it, when cooled on a pewter spoon, forms a soft, pliable ball. That ball is then rolled in powdered sugar and placed on a marble slab to cool. These are not yet candies in the modern sense. They are still clearly medicines, labelled with ominous Latin names like Trichisci de Glycyrrhiza. But to the common labourer who cannot afford a physician, they are a godsend. They are portable, they do not spoil, and they can be slipped into a pocket and sucked slowly during a long day at the cloth mill or the wharf. What is fascinating, and what we often forget, is that the apothecary's turn towards sweetness was not motivated by any scientific breakthrough in pharmacology. It was motivated by compliance, by the simple pedestrian observation that children, in particular, would spit out bitter draughts, and that even adults would prefer a week of a mild cough to a single spoonful of wormwood. Grindal and his contemporaries read the old herbals, from culpepper to Dioscorides, and they noticed that many ancient remedies included honey or grape syrup. They were simply reviving a Roman practice, but with a colonial twist. Refined cane sugar was cheaper than honey, more stable, and it lacked the floral variabilities of bee product. So they standardized their sugar base. They even invented a term for these sweetened medicines. Electuaries, a thick, sugary paste taken by licking off a spoon. The lozenge, the hard drop, was the true innovation. It had a longer shelf life, it could be molded into uniform shapes, and it gave the apothecary a chance to display his craftsmanship. Some shops began to colour their lozenges with vegetable dyes. Red for raspberry, for sore throats, yellow for saffron, for liver complaints, pale green for mint, for stomach aches. They looked like jewels in their glass jars, and they drew customers through the door as much as the brass pestle above the signboard. Now, let us linger on a specific November afternoon in Grindal's shop. The rain is pattering against the lidded windows, and the fire in the hearth casts a flickering glow across the floor. A woman in a warm cloak enters, carrying a small child who is listless and feverish. Grindal does not ask for a diagnosis. He simply feels the child's forehead, looks at the mother, and says, "I'll give you a draught of bark in a syrup of rose hips. You will take it, because it tastes of summer." He prepares the mixture in a mortar, adding a generous spoonful of sugar and a pinch of cinnamon to mask the quinine. The child, barely conscious, still turns his head at the scent. He opens his mouth. He swallows. The mother weeps with relief, not because the medicine is strong, but because her child accepted it. This small, quiet victory is the heart of the apothecary's art. It is not heroic. It is not heroic. It is the mundane miracle of making the unpalatable palatable, of transforming a bitter necessity into a sweet ritual. And yet, there is a shadow beneath this sugary surface. The sugar itself comes from a system of forced labour that Grindal never sees and barely thinks about. The barrels arrive with the names of shipping companies, but he does not inquire about the conditions on the plantations. He is a craftsman, not a politician. He sees only the neat white crystals that dissolve so obediently in his copper pans. He also does not consider that his candy-like cures might lead to dependence. Not addiction in the modern sense, but a psychological reliance on sweetened remedies that could mask more serious ailments. A patient might suck a dozen lozenges a day, feeling better for the taste, while a tubercular infection deepens in their lungs. But that is the limitation of his era. He works with what he has, and what he has is a growing belief that medicine should be tolerated, not endured, as the evening draws in. Grindal closes his shop, counts his coppers, and writes in his ledger. Sold 48 peppermint lozenges to Mrs. Barnaby, 2s. Sold 24 saffron drops to the vicar, verse 16. He adds a note. Sugar stock low, order 2 barrels from Wapping. He then banks the fire, covers his mortar with a cloth, and climbs the narrow staircase to his living quarters above the shop. He does not think of himself as a pioneer. He thinks of himself as a man who makes a decent living by helping his neighbors swallow their medicine. But you, listening from 2 centuries away, know that he is part of a slow, sweet revolution, one that will eventually give birth to the modern pharmaceutical industry with its coated tablets, flavored syrups, and chewable vitamins. All of that begins here, in a foggy London street, with a boiled sweet and a persistent cough. But there is a question that hangs in the air, a loose thread in the tapestry of this sugary tale. If the apothecaries were so happy to sweeten their wares, why did they not simply sell pure sugar candies and forget the medicine altogether? Why the pretense of healing? The answer, as we will discover in the next section, lies in the strange legal and guild restrictions of the time, and in the quiet rivalry between the apothecary, the grocer, and the physician. The line between a sweet and a cure was, in 1742, a perilous one, and crossing it could land a man in court. So how did Grindal and his peers navigate this sticky boundary? And what happened when a customer asked for a candy that was only a candy? The answer will reveal the curious economics of pleasure and health in the Georgian era, and it may just change the way you think about that packet of throat lozenges in your own coat pocket. Section 2. The sticky boundaries of law and guild. You are still in that narrow London street, but the fog has thickened into a soft November drizzle, and the gas lamps have just been lit, casting wavering orange pools across the wet cobbles. It is now a few weeks after your first visit to Thomas Grindal's shop, and you have returned not because you are ill, but because you have become curious about those amber lozenges. You push open the door, and the familiar scent of honey and anise wraps around you like a warm blanket. Grindal looks up from his ledger, nods, and gestures to a chair by the hearth. He is compounding a fresh batch of peppermint drops, and he works with the slow, deliberate care of a man who has learned that haste spoils both medicine and temper. He does not mind your watching. In fact, he seems to enjoy the quiet company. As he stirs the bubbling syrup with a long wooden spatula, he begins to talk. Not about his recipes, but about a letter he received that morning from the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries. The letter, he explains, was a warning. It reminded him that he must not sell his lozenges to customers who are not visibly unwell, nor must he advertise them as sweetmeats or confections in his shop window. To do so, the letter insists, would be to encroach upon the legal territory of the Grocers' Company, a rival guild with ancient rights over the sale of sugar, spices, and all things edible. And here, dear listener, we stumble upon one of the most peculiar and tedious, yet utterly fascinating, legal quagmires of Georgian commerce, the bitter war between the apothecaries and the grocers over the precise definition of a medicine versus a sweet. You see, the apothecaries' trade had been regulated since the time of Henry VIII, when the Royal College of Physicians was given the power to inspect apothecaries' shops and seize any defective medicines. But the apothecaries were not physicians, they were tradesmen, and they belonged to the Grocers' Company by default, until 1617, when they broke away to form their own worshipful society. This schism was not about science, it was about money. The grocers had long controlled the import and retail of sugar, pepper, cloves, and cinnamon, the very ingredients that apothecaries needed for their electuaries and syrups. The apothecaries wanted to buy these goods wholesale without paying the grocers' markup. The grocers, in turn, wanted to prevent apothecaries from selling anything that could be eaten as a food, because that would undercut their own shops. The result was a tangle of bylaws, court cases, and parliamentary petitions that lasted for generations. Now, let us walk with Grindal as he takes you into his back storeroom, a narrow, dimly lit space lined with earthenware jars and labelled drawers. He pulls out a heavy, leather-bound volume, the Pharmacopoeia Londinensis of 1721, and opens it to a page that lists the official recipes for Trochicipes protusitis. He points to the entry for Trochishi de menthe, peppermint lozenges. It calls for dried peppermint leaves, powdered sugar, and gum arabic, all mixed into a paste and rolled into small cylinders. But here is the rub. The official recipe does not include any medicinal ingredient beyond the mint itself, which was considered mild enough to be merely a flavouring. So why? Grindal asks with a dry chuckle. Is this a medicine at all? Why can a grocer not sell an identical item? The answer lies in intent and dispensing. An apothecary, by law, must dispense his lozenges in response to a patient's complaint. A cough, a sour stomach, a hoarse voice, and he must write the sale in his ledger as a cure. A grocer, on the other hand, sells sweets for pure pleasure. The same peppermint drop, sold by a grocer, is a confection. Sold by an apothecary, it is a pectoral. The difference is not in the sugar, but in the paperwork. And the penalty for mixing up that paperwork was, in Grindle's time, a fine of £5 per offence, roughly 2 months' wages for a labourer. This legal ambiguity shaped the apothecary's daily routine in ways that are hard for us to imagine. Every morning, Grindle would open his shop and glance at the street to see if the grocer's inspectors were making their rounds. If they were, he would take down the small slate sign that advertised lozenges for all palates and replace it with a more sober one reading pectoral drops for chest complaints. Under any circumstances, offer a lozenge to a customer who had not first described a symptom. A customer who walked in and simply said, "I'd like a pennyworth of those yellow sweets," would be told, "I'm sorry, sir, but these are for biliousness. Are you feeling bilious?" The customer would invariably nod, even if they felt perfectly fine, and the sale would proceed legally. This little dance of polite fiction was repeated thousands of times across London, and it became a quiet joke among apothecaries, a knowing wink across the carrer. But there was a darker side to this guild warfare. In the 1740s, the Grocers' Company began a campaign of aggressive litigation against several apothecaries who had been selling sugar plums and candied fruits during the Christmas season. The grocers argued that these were confectionery, not medicines, and they sued for damages. One notable case, Grocers v. Pettigrew, 1743, dragged on for 3 years with endless depositions from chemists, physicians, and even confectioners. The court eventually ruled that any product containing more than 1 part sugar to 1 part active ingredient was, by definition, a confection, unless the apothecary could prove that the active ingredient was potent enough to alter the humours. This led to a bizarre arms race. Apothecaries began adding tiny amounts of rhubarb, gentian, or even powdered snakewood to their sugar drops, just to push the ratio back into medicinal territory. The lozenges became bitter again, but the apothecaries would then add even more sugar to mask the bitterness, creating a feedback loop of compounding. The result was that, by 1750, a typical apothecary's lozenge might contain only 2% active herb and 98% sugar, yet it was legally a medicine, because that 2% was potent enough on paper. Let us pause and sit with Grindle as he takes a break from his stirring. He pours you a small cup of warm sage tea, another of his medicinal offerings, though you suspect it is mostly for comfort. And he reflects on the absurdity of it all. He tells you a story about a colleague in Southwark who was fined for selling rose-flavoured syrups to a midwife for nourishing new mothers. The grocers claimed that rose syrup was a food, not a medicine. But the apothecary produced a receipt showing that the rose syrup had been mixed with a tincture of iron, making it a tonic for anemia. The court accepted the defence, but the apothecary had to pay legal fees of over £20. A devastating blow to a small shop. Grindle shakes his head and says, quietly, "We are not healers, we are scribblers. We write our way out of trouble." And there is a profound truth in that. The apothecary's true skill was not pharmacology, but documentation. His ledger was his shield. His receipt was his sword. Now, consider the practical implications for the ordinary Londoner who walked through Grindle's door. You, as a customer, had to learn the language of symptoms. You could not say, "I fancy something sweet." You had to say, "I feel a rawness in my throat," or "my humours are sluggish." The apothecary would then nod sagely and offer you a lozenge that was, to all intents and purposes, a boiled sweet, but which he would record as trochishi de hysopo, hyssop lozenges, for catarrh. You would pay your penny, slip the packet into your pocket, and suck it contentedly on your walk home. You were complicit in the fiction, and you did not mind. The taste was worth the small lie. And in this way, the apothecary's shop became a peculiar sanctuary, a place where pleasure and health were legally intertwined, but only if everyone agreed to pretend otherwise. Yet, the legal pressures also forced the apothecaries to become more innovative. Since they could not sell pure confections, they began to develop more complex recipes that were undeniably medicinal. but still delicious. They experimented with chocolate, which had just begun to arrive from the Americas, mixing it with cinnamon and ginger to create a warming paste for stomachic complaints. They also used caraway seeds and fennel, which were recognized as digestives, but which also tasted wonderfully aromatic. Grindle himself has a secret recipe for a cardamom and clove lozenge that he sells only to a few trusted customers. It is remarkably similar to modern breath mints, but he insists it is for ache of the gums. He winks as he says this, and you understand that he is not deceiving anyone. He is simply playing his part in a centuries-old comedy of guild regulations. But there is a deeper question lurking beneath this legal farce. If the apothecaries were, in effect, selling candy disguised as medicine, did they themselves believe in their own remedies? Grindle, to his credit, is a man of genuine conviction. He has seen peppermint soothe a colicky infant, and he has watched honey calm a hacking cough. He knows that sugar itself is a preservative, a demulcent, and a mild painkiller, because the warmth of dissolving sugar can distract the nerves from deeper aches. He does not think he is a fraud. He thinks he is a pragmatist. The law forces him to call his lozenges pectorals, but his own experience tells him that they work, not because of the hyssop or the rhubarb, but because of the simple act of sucking on something sweet, which soothes the mind and relaxes the throat. He is, in a way, an early practitioner of the placebo effect, though he would never use that word. He calls it comforting the spirits. And so, the evening deepens outside Grindle's window, and the rain has turned to a soft sleet. He packs away his copper pan, scrapes the remaining syrup into a stone jar, and washes his hands in a basin of cold water. He looks tired but content. He has sold 30 dozen lozenges that day, and only 2 of his customers had genuine fevers. The rest were simply weary of winter, longing for a taste of summer. He does not judge them. He serves them. He knows that his trade is built on a shaky legal foundation, but he also knows that his neighbors trust him more than they trust the physician with his lancets and leeches. He is not a healer of bodies. He is a healer of spirits, and he does it with sugar. But there is one more complication that we have not yet explored, a complication that we have not yet explored. In the final section of this story, reveal the true danger hidden within Grindle's candy-like cures. For all the legal wrangling over guild boundaries, neither the grocers nor the apothecaries considered the possibility that sugar itself might not be entirely benign. What happened when a customer grew too fond of those lozenges, taking them not for a cough, but for the comfort of their sweetness? And what of the children, who were given these drops as a treat, and who began to demand them daily? The apothecary's gentle deception was about to meet its match in the very real problem of overindulgence, a problem that would force Grindle to confront a question he had long avoided. Is it still medicine if the patient takes it for pleasure alone? Section 3. The bitter aftertaste, the sleet has turned to a steady, silent snowfall by the time Grindle blows out his last candle and climbs the creaking stairs to his sleeping quarters. You are not there with him now. You have returned to your own hearth, your pocket heavy with a small bag of his peppermint drops. But you can imagine him settling into his worn armchair, his feet up on a stool, a cup of warm milk in his hand. He is thinking, as he often does, about the day's customers. There was the baker's boy who came in with a story about a sore tooth, but who left with a dozen aniseed lozenges, his eyes bright with anticipation. There was the elderly widow who buys a shilling's worth of ginger candies every week, claiming they ease her rheumatism, though Grindle suspects she simply craves the heat of the spice. And there was the young mother with her feverish child, the one who wept with relief when her son swallowed the rosehip syrup. Grindle feels a quiet satisfaction, a sense of having done some small good in a world that offers little comfort. But as he sips his milk, a nagging thought creeps into his mind, a thought that has been troubling him for months. He has noticed that several of his regular customers are returning more frequently than their ailments warrant. The baker's boy, for instance, has visited 3 times this week, each time with a different complaint. A headache, a chill, a twinge in his shoulder. But each time, he buys the same aniseed lozenge. Grindle has also observed the widow's rheumatism does not seem to improve. She simply appears more cheerful after her weekly purchase. He has even caught his own apprentice sneaking a few sugar plums from the back shelf, claiming he needed strength for his lifting. Grindle is not a fool. He knows that sugar is pleasant. He knows that pleasant things can be desired. And he knows, dimly, that desire can become habit. But in 1742, the concept of sugar addiction does not exist. There is no word for it, no medical framework to explain why a person might crave sweetness beyond the natural appetite for nourishment. The closest the physicians come is the old Galenic notion of pleasure corrupting the humours. But that is a vague moral warning, not a clinical observation. And yet, Grindle has begun to see the effects with his own eyes. Take the case of Mr. Holloway, a prosperous tallow chandler who lives 3 streets away. Holloway first came to Grindle 2 years ago, complaining of a persistent cough that kept him awake at night. Grindle prescribed a course of horehound lozenges, and the cough improved. But Mr. Holloway did not stop buying the lozenges. He increased his order. He now purchases a large packet every week, and he has confided to Grindle that he sucks on them constantly throughout the day, even during his work hours, when the tallow fumes are thick enough to choke a horse. Mr. Holloway's teeth have begun to darken at the roots, and his breath has a sour, fermented quality that Grindle notices when the man leans over the counter. Grindle has gently suggested that he might reduce his intake, but Mr. Holloway waves away the advice, insisting that the lozenges are the only thing that keeps his spirits up. Grindle cannot argue with that. The man is indeed cheerful, albeit more portly than he used to be. Then there is the matter of the children. The children of London have discovered Grindle's shop, and they have discovered that if they feign a sniffle or a tummy ache, they can often persuade their mothers to buy them a pennyworth of medicinal sweets. The mothers are not deceived. They know that the lozenges are largely sugar, but they reason that a child who is sucking a sweet is a child who is quiet, and a quiet child is a blessing in a cramped tenement. So the trade flourishes, and Grindle's ledger shows an increasing number of sales to households with young children. He does not think of this as harmful. He thinks of it as harmless pleasure, a small luxury in a harsh life. But he has begun to notice that some of these children are not growing properly. Their teeth, like Mr. Holloway's, are showing signs of decay, and a few of them have developed a chronic looseness of the bowels that the physicians call the sugar flux. Grindle has even heard of a case in Suffolk where a child of 4 consumed so many sugar drops that he refused all solid for days, becoming weak and lethargic. The mother blamed the apothecary. The apothecary blamed the mother, and the child eventually recovered, but the incident left a stain on the reputation of the sweetened remedy. Now, let us step back and consider the larger picture, because Grindle's small worries are part of a much wider debate that is beginning to simmer in the medical pamphlets and coffeehouse conversations of the 1740s. A few voices, a very few, have started to question the wholesale embrace of sugar in medicine. One such voice belongs to Dr. John Rutty, a Quaker physician who published a tract in 1745 titled A Cautionary Essay on the Use of Sugar in Diet and Physic. Rutty argued that sugar, while useful as a preservative and a flavouring, could overheat the blood and generate a melancholic adust humour if taken in excess. He cited cases of patients who had developed skin eruptions, dental caries, and a peculiar languor of the limbs after prolonged consumption of sweetened medicines. Rutty was not a radical. He was a deeply traditional Galenist, and his arguments were couched in the ancient language of the 4 humours. But his pamphlet reached a wide audience, and it caused a flutter of anxiety among apothecaries who feared that their sugary wares might be blamed for new diseases. Grindle has read Rutty's pamphlet, or at least the summary of it that appeared in the Gentleman's Magazine. He does not fully agree with it. He thinks Rutty is overly alarmist. But he cannot dismiss it entirely. He has seen the darkening teeth, the sour breath, the languor in children. He has also noticed that some of his older patients, who have been taking his lozenges for years, are now complaining of a persistent dryness in the mouth and a strange, burning sensation in their stomachs after eating. He has begun to wonder if sugar, in large quantities, might be doing something more than just sweetening the humours. But he has no tools to investigate this. He has no chemistry beyond the simple decoctions and distillations of his apprenticeship. He can only observe, record, and adjust. So Grindle makes a quiet decision. He will not stop selling sweetened lozenges. That would ruin his business. But he will begin to reduce the sugar content in his recipes, ever so slightly, and he will increase the proportion of bitter herbs like gentian and wormwood. He reasons that a slightly more bitter lozenge will discourage overindulgence, while still remaining palatable enough to serve its medicinal purpose. He tests this new formula on his apprentice, who grimaces at the first taste but admits that it is still tolerable. Grindal then rolls out the new lozenges to his regular customers, without telling them of the change. He watches their reactions closely. Some of them notice immediately and ask if he has altered the recipe. He replies, truthfully, that he has adjusted the balance of humors in the formulation. A few customers complain and switch to a competitor, but most of them simply shrug and continue buying, because the lozenges are still sweet enough to be pleasant, and they trust Grindal more than they trust their own palates. This quiet adjustment, this tiny, almost imperceptible shift toward bitterness, represents a pivotal moment in the history of pharmacy. It is the first time that an apothecary has consciously reduced the sugar content of a popular remedy out of concern for its long-term effects, rather than out of legal necessity or cost saving. Grindal is not a reformer. He is not a pioneer of public health. He is simply a man who has noticed a pattern and responded with the tools at his disposal. But his small act of caution will ripple forward, influencing other apothecaries who hear of his new recipe. By the 1760s, it will become common practice in London to add a bittering agent to lozenges, not for flavor, but for deterrence, to ensure that patients do not mistake medicine for confection. The sugar content will still be high, but the bitter edge will remind the user that this is a treatment, not a treat. And yet, the human appetite for sweetness is not so easily deterred. Even as Grindal adds wormwood to his drops, he knows that his customers will adapt. They will acquire a taste for the bitterness. They will even learn to enjoy the complexity of the flavor. The human palate is remarkably flexible, and the desire for sugar is deeply rooted in our biology, a vestige of our evolutionary past when sweet fruits were rare and calorie-dense. Grindal cannot erase that desire. He can only manage its expression. He also knows that he is not the only purveyor of sweetness in London. The grocers, the confectioners, and the street vendors are all selling sugar in various forms, and none of them are restrained by medical ethics. If he makes his lozenges too bitter, his customers will simply buy their sweets elsewhere, so he compromises. He makes his lozenges just bitter enough to satisfy his conscience, but sweet enough to satisfy his customers. It is a delicate balancing act, and he performs it with the same steady hand that he uses to pour his syrups. Now, as the snow continues to fall outside his window, Grindal finishes his milk and sets the cup aside. He looks at his ledger, open to the day's entries, and he sees the names of his customers. The baker's boy, the widow, Holloway, the young mother, and he realizes that he has become more than a merchant to them. He has become a fixture in their daily lives, a source of small comforts and quiet rituals. They do not come to him for dramatic cures. They come to him for the familiar taste of something warm, something that reminds them of childhood, something that makes the long winter evenings feel a little less bleak. He is, in his own modest way, a keeper of the social fabric, a man who trades not in miracles but in small, repeatable pleasures. And that, perhaps, is the true legacy of the 18th century apothecary and his candy-like cures. They did not transform medicine through great discoveries or heroic interventions. They transformed it through the humble art of making the ordinary bearable, the bitter tolerable, and the unpleasant endurable. They understood, long before modern psychology, that health is not merely the absence of disease, but the presence of comfort. A lozenge that soothes a cough is a medicine. A lozenge that soothes the soul is a treasure. Grindal's lozenges did both, even if he could not always distinguish one from the other. So let us leave Grindal now, as he banks the fire and slips into his cold bed, pulling the heavy woolen blankets up to his chin. He does not sleep immediately. He lies awake for a few minutes, listening to the soft hiss of the snow against the window panes, and he thinks about the widow and the baker's boy and all the others who will return tomorrow. He wonders, for a fleeting moment, if he is doing more harm than good. He wonders if his sugar-laden remedies are merely postponing the inevitable, or if they are genuinely helping people endure their lives. He has no answer, only the quiet assurance that he has tried his best, that he has never knowingly harmed anyone, and that he has always been honest about the limitations of his art. That is enough for him. It is enough for his customers. And it is enough, dear listener, to carry us forward into the next story. A story about the rivals who stood outside his shop, selling their own sweetened cures without the burden of a guild license, and who forced Grindal to defend his trade not with sugar, but with something far more precious, his reputation. As you drift towards sleep, consider this. Every time you reach for a cough drop or a throat lozenge in your own modern life, you are tasting a faint echo of Grindal's copper pan. The sugar is still there, the mint is still there, and the legal fiction that it is medicine is still there, though now it is written on a label, not in a label, not in a ledger. The same questions that troubled Grindal in 1742 still trouble us today. How much sweetness is too much? When does comfort become dependence? And who decides where the line falls between remedy and indulgence? These questions have no easy answers, but they are worth asking, especially as you let your thoughts slowly dissolve into the soft white silence of the falling snow. Story 2. The Quack's Quiet Rival. Respectable Apothecaries versus Street Sellers, Section 1. The bawdy chorus of the market stall. Let us step away from the quiet, orderly warmth of Thomas Grindal's shop, and walk instead into the chaotic heart of London's Cheapside on a brisk Saturday morning in the spring of 1743. The air here is not perfumed with honey and anise. It is a thick, unruly broth of smells. Fresh fish from Billingsgate, horse dung drying on the cobbles, roasting chestnuts, wet wool, and the sharp, acrid tang of tanneries wafting from the nearby Thames. The noise is overwhelming. Cartwheels grinding against stone, peddlers shouting their wares, dogs barking, children shrieking, and above it all, the rhythmic, sing-song chant of a man standing on a wooden crate near the fountain. He is not dressed like Grindal, in a sober linen apron and woolen waistcoat. He wears a gaudy red coat, slightly too large for him, and a tricorn hat that has seen better decades. He has a brass bell in one hand and a tray of brightly coloured lozenges in the other, and he is selling them with the theatrical flair of a fairground barker. "Hark, good people," he cries, his voice carrying over the hubbub. "Step forward, ye weary, ye wheezy, ye weak of limb and short of breath. Here lies the cure for all that ails ye, made not by your learned physicians with their bleeding and their leeches, but by the simple, honest hands of nature herself. 1 penny buys ye a drop of purest balsam, sweet as a maiden's kiss, that will clear your lungs, brighten your eyes, and put a spring in your step that would shame a May morning." He rings his bell again, and a small crowd gathers. Shop boys, milkmaids, a few porters taking a break from their loads, and an old woman with a basket of herbs who eyes him with a mixture of disdain and professional jealousy. They are the poor, the working, the desperate, and the merely curious. They are the people who cannot afford the 2 shillings that Grindal charges for a week's supply of his pectoral lozenges. They are the people who live, as the saying goes, from hand to mouth. And for them, a penny is a significant sum, but one they are willing to spend if it promises relief from the constant, grinding misery of a damp climate and an empty belly. This man on the crate is a quack or a mountebank in the parlance of the time, though he would call himself a herbalist or a professor of physic. His name, if you asked him, is Jeremiah Spatchcock, and he has been plying his trade on this very spot for the better part of a decade. He is not a member of the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries. He has no guild license, no formal apprenticeship, no 7-year training in Latin declensions or the weighing of gentian root. He learned his craft on the road, travelling from fair to fair, watching older sellers, picking up scraps of knowledge and developing a talent for improvisation that Grindal would never dare to attempt. His lozenges are simpler than Grindal's. They are mostly sugar, and not the refined white sugar that comes from the colonies, but a cheaper, browner variety that still carries a hint of molasses, mixed with a few common herbs like peppermint or fennel, and sometimes a dash of aniseed oil for a more penetrating scent. He colours them with vegetable dyes, but he is not careful about the exact shade. Some are orange, some are green, and some are a murky brown that looks suspiciously like what it is: cooked sugar with a bit of leaf. And yet Jeremiah Spatchcock sells more lozenges in a single market day than Thomas Grindal sells in a week. Why? Because he understands something that Grindal, for all his careful bookkeeping, has failed to fully grasp: the power of performance. When a customer buys from Spatchcock, they do not simply buy a lozenge. They buy a story. They buy the bright, confident voice that promises a miraculous cure. They buy the brass bell that makes them feel like they are participating in a carnival. They buy the slightly ridiculous red coat that assures them that this man is a character, a rogue, a lovable scoundrel, who might just be clever enough to have stumbled upon a secret that the stuffy physicians have overlooked. They are not deceived. They are entertained. And in a world where life is hard and joy is scarce, entertainment is a valuable commodity. Now, let us take a closer look at one of Spatchcock's customers. Her name is Martha, a widow of 52, who works as a seamstress in a cramped garret near St. Paul's. She has a chronic cough that she has had for years, and she has tried Grindle's lozenges once, but she could not afford to keep buying them. She now buys a pennyworth of Spatchcock's golden balsam drops every Friday, and she finds that they soothe her throat just as well. At least, she believes they do. The belief, in this case, is as powerful as the ingredient. She does not know that Spatchcock's drops contain less than a tenth of the herb that Grindle uses. She only knows that when she pops one of the bright orange discs into her mouth, she feels a momentary release from the tightness in her chest. The sugar, warm and melting on her tongue, triggers a small rush of comfort, a Pavlovian response that she associates with the pleasant memory of childhood candies. She does not question the efficacy of the cure. She simply appreciates the relief. But here is where the tension between the respectable apothecary and the street seller becomes truly fascinating. Grindle, like all guild members, despises Spatchcock. He regards him as a charlatan, a fraud, a danger to public health who undercuts honest trade with cheap imitations. Yet, if we were to sit Grindle down and ask him to explain the precise difference between his own lozenges and Spatchcock's, he would struggle to articulate it beyond the legal definitions we explored in the previous story. Both contain sugar. Both contain herbs. Both are sold to people with coughs and colds. The real difference is one of intent, training, and reputation. Grindle has a ledger, a mortar, a copy of the Pharmacopoeia Londinensis, and a guild certificate hanging on his wall. Spatchcock has none of those things. But to Martha, the seamstress, those papers matter less than the presence of a friendly face on a Saturday morning and the promise of a moment's peace. This rivalry was not merely a commercial dispute. It was a deeply entrenched social conflict that reflected the broader anxieties of the age. The 1740s were a time when the boundaries between legitimate medicine and charlatanism were still remarkably porous. Physicians, who held university degrees and belonged to the Royal College, looked down on apothecaries as mere tradesmen, no better than grocers. Apothecaries, in turn, looked down on the street sellers as unlettered peasants, and street sellers, like Spatchcock, looked down on everyone because they were free from the constraints of guild regulations and could sell whatever they liked, however they liked, without fear of being hauled before a board of inspectors. The freedom, of course, came with risks. If Spatchcock's lozenges made someone seriously ill, he could be prosecuted for manslaughter, or worse, for practicing physic without a license. But the authorities were remarkably lax in enforcing these laws, especially among the poor, because the poor were not the ones who complained to magistrates. They simply suffered in silence, or they stopped buying from Spatchcock and found another vendor. Let us pause and spend a few moments with Spatchcock after the market rush has died down. He packs his tray, folds his wooden crate, and walks to a nearby tavern where he drinks a mug of small beer and counts his takings. He has made nearly 4 shillings that day, a decent profit that will keep him in cheap lodgings and allow him to buy more sugar and herbs from a wholesaler in Southwark. He is not a rich man. He is not a rich man. He does not have to answer to a guild. He does not have to keep a ledger. He does not have to worry about the grocer's company suing him for selling confections because he does not even pretend that his wares are medicines in the legal sense. He calls them balsam drops and soothing pastilles, vague terms that do not fit neatly into any regulatory category. He is, in his own way, a master of legal ambiguity, just like Grindle. But his approach is brash and improvisational rather than cautious and documented. Now, consider the irony of this situation. Grindle, who meticulously follows the rules, who adds just enough bitter herb to his lozenges to legally qualify as a medicine, who records every sale with exacting precision. He is constantly worried about inspectors, fines, and guild reprisals. Spatchcock, who ignores the rules entirely, who sells colorful sugar drops with no pretense of official recognition. He is remarkably free from such anxieties. He has been arrested once, about 5 years ago, for peddling without a license. But he paid a small fine and went back to his trade the next day. The magistrate did not care about the quality of his lozenges. He cared only about the collection of revenue. Spatchcock understood this, and he adapted. He now pays a small weekly fee to the local constable, who turns a blind eye to his activities. It is a quiet, unspoken arrangement, a bribe disguised as a charitable donation, and it works. But there is another dimension to this rivalry, one that touches on the very nature of trust in a pre-modern society. Grindle's customers trust him because of his long-established presence, his fixed address, his reliable recipes. They know that if something goes wrong, they can find him. They can knock on his door, complain, and demand satisfaction. Spatchcock's customers trust him for an entirely different reason. They trust his charm. They trust the bravado, the bright voice, the promise of a cure that sounds too good to be true. Because in a world full of broken promises, a confident lie is often more appealing than a timid truth. The poor are not naive. They have learned to distinguish between the different kinds of fraud. They know that Spatchcock is exaggerating, but they also know that his lozenges taste good and cost little. And that is enough. They do not expect miracles. They expect a small, affordable comfort. And Spatchcock delivers that, just as Grindle does, but through a different channel. Now, as the evening begins to settle over Cheapside, Spatchcock emerges from the tavern, a little tipsy but still steady on his feet. He walks back to his lodgings, a single room above a chandler's shop where he will spend the evening boiling more sugar and adding a few drops of peppermint oil to his next batch. He does not measure precisely. He works by eye and by smell, a method that Grindle would find reckless. But Spatchcock has been doing this for years, and he knows his business. He also knows that his lozenges are not cures, but he does not dwell on that. He tells himself that even if they do nothing, they do no harm, and that the pleasure they bring is worth the penny. It is a justification, a thin one, but it is enough to let him sleep at night. And as he drifts off, his head full of sugar and small beer, he thinks about the apothecaries in their neat shops with their brass scales and their guild certificates. He does not envy them. He pities them. They are trapped, he thinks, in their own respectability, bound by rules that limit their freedom and their profits. He, on the other hand, is a free man, a creature of the streets, a king of the pavement. He does not know that Grindle lies awake at night, troubled by the same questions that trouble all honest craftsmen. Am I doing good? Am I harming anyone? Am I worthy of my customers' trust? Spatchcock does not ask these questions, and perhaps that is why he sleeps so soundly. But the rivalry between these two men is not just a personal one. It is a reflection of a deeper transformation happening in 18th century England. The old guild system, with its careful hierarchies and regulations, is beginning to crack under the pressure of a growing urban population and an increasingly commercial economy. The street sellers, the quacks, the wandering herbalists, they represent a new, chaotic energy that cannot be contained by the old rules. The apothecaries, with their guild charters and their Latin pharmacopoeias, represent the old order, the world of craft and tradition. The tension between them will eventually lead to a shift in the legal landscape, a redefinition of what constitutes a medicine and who has the right to sell it. But that shift is still decades away, and in the meantime, the market square remains a battleground where the respectable and the roguish compete for the same pennies. As you listen to the distant echo of Spatchcock's bell fading into the night, consider this. Which of these two men would you trust with your cough? The sober, careful apothecary with his guild seal, or the cheerful, theatrical seller with his brass bell and his red coat? The answer might depend not on the lozenge itself, but on the story you want to believe. And that, in the end, is the quiet tragedy of the quack's rivalry. It forces us to choose between the comfort of authority and the charm of rebellion, between the predictable and the tantalizing, between the bitter truth and the sweet lie. Section 2. The constable's knock and the crowd's verdict. The spring of 1744 brought not only warmer weather to London, but also a simmering unease that rippled through the narrow alleys and market squares like a low, persistent fever. Thomas Grindal, for all his careful neutrality, had reached a breaking point. He had watched Jeremiah Spatchcock's trade flourish for months, and he had seen several of his own regular customers, the baker's boy, the widow, even Mr. Holloway, occasionally stray to the cheaper vendor on Cheapside. Grindal did not begrudge them their pennies. He understood that poverty was a cruel master. But he could not tolerate the flagrant falsehoods Spatchcock shouted to the crowd. He had heard the man claim that his lozenges could cure the dropsy and even the creeping palsy. And Grindal knew, with the quiet certainty of a trained craftsman, that such promises were dangerous. They gave false hope. They delayed real treatment. And, in the worst cases, they might cause a sufferer to abandon a genuine remedy for a sugar-coated illusion. So Grindal did something that he had never done before in his 30 years of trade. He wrote a letter to the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries, requesting that they send an inspector to observe the activities on Cheapside and to take action against the unlicensed vendors who were deceiving the public and bringing the honorable art of thieving the underbringing measured and carefully worded, couched in the deferential language of a guild member who knew his place. He did not name Spatchcock directly. He spoke of a person of irregular habits and questionable origins who sold preparations of unknown composition from a movable store. He enclosed a which he had purchased discreetly, and he noted that the quality of the sugar was coarse and that the herb content was barely discernible. He signed the letter with his name and the date, and he sent it off by messenger. Weeks passed. Grindal heard nothing. He began to wonder if his letter had been lost, or if the society was too preoccupied with its own internal disputes to bother with a street vendor. Then, on a warm Thursday afternoon in June, he received a terse reply. The society thanked him for his vigilance and informed him that they would make inquiries. That was all. No promises of action, no commitments to send inspectors. Grindal felt a pang of disappointment, but he also understood the limitations of his guild. The society was a bureaucratic body, slow to act and cautious about overstepping its bounds. It did not have its own police force. It could only petition the magistrates, who were often reluctant to intervene in petty market disputes. The quacks, as Grindal was discovering, were protected by a curious kind of legal invisibility. They were too small to prosecute, too poor to fine, and too popular to suppress. But Grindal's letter did have one unintended consequence. It reached the ears of a local magistrate named Sir Humphrey Peabody, a man who prided himself on his public spiritedness and his hatred of disorder. Sir Humphrey was not a member of the society, but he was a frequent visitor to the coffee houses where apothecaries and physicians gathered, and he had a keen interest in the regulation of public health. He read Grindal's letter with growing indignation, and he decided to take matters into his own hands. He ordered his constables to make a surprise inspection of the market stalls on Cheapside the following Saturday, with instructions to arrest any unlicensed vendor selling medicinal preparations without a guild certificate. The constables, who were accustomed to breaking up brawls and chasing pickpockets, were not entirely sure what a medicinal preparation looked like, but they understood the basic instruction. Seize the man in the red coat with the brass bell. Saturday arrived, bright and bustling. Spatchcock set up his crate in his usual spot, rang his bell, and began his familiar chant. The crowd gathered, as it always did, and the coins began to drop into his open palm. He was in the middle of a particularly florid description of his balsam of life when he noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The crowd parted slightly, and two constables in their dull blue uniforms pushed through, their faces set in expressions of grim determination. Spatchcock froze for a moment, his hand still raised, his bell silent. He had been arrested before, but that was years ago, and he had assumed that his arrangement with the local constable was still in effect. He had not counted on a magistrate with a personal grudge. "Jeremiah Spatchcock," said the taller constable, his voice flat and official. "You are hereby apprehended for selling medicinal wares without a license from the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries, contrary to the statutes of the realm. You will come with us." Spatchcock, to his credit, did not panic. He had faced worse in his travelling days. He smiled, spread his hands wide, and addressed the crowd in his most theatrical tone. "Good people, you see how the learned gentlemen protect their monopoly. They cannot bear that a poor man should offer relief at a penny, while they charge a shilling for the same. They call me a fraud, but I ask you, have my drops ever harmed any of you? Have they not eased your coughs and lifted your spirits?" The crowd murmured. Some of them were genuinely loyal to Spatchcock, others were simply annoyed that their Saturday entertainment was being interrupted. A few of them began to mutter against the constables, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. Grindle, who had heard of the impending raid from a colleague, had slipped out of his shop and made his way to Cheapside, positioning himself at the edge of the crowd. He watched the scene unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. He wanted Spatchcock punished, but he had not anticipated the public sympathy that the quack would elicit. He heard a woman in front of him say, "Leave him be. He's a good man, he is. Gave me drops for my little girl's fever when your doctor wanted 2 guineas. The woman's words stung Grindle, not because they were untrue, but because they touched a nerve. He knew that the poor were often priced out of legitimate medicine, and he felt, in that moment, a flicker of doubt about his own actions. Was he, by seeking to suppress Spatchcock, also suppressing the only affordable remedy that many of these people could access? The constables, in the end, did not arrest Spatchcock. The crowd had grown too large and too vocal, and the officers were outnumbered. They confiscated his tray of lozenges, demanded that he stop selling for the remainder of the week, and threatened him with further action if he reappeared. Then they departed, pushing through the crowd with some difficulty. Spatchcock, left standing on his crate with an empty tray, did not look defeated. He looked triumphant. He had been martyred, in a small way, and he knew that his customers would remember his humiliation and reward him with their loyalty. He gathered his crate, bowed to the crowd, and disappeared into a side alley, his red coat flapping behind him like a banner of defiance. Grindle walked home slowly, his thoughts heavy. He had achieved a partial victory. Spatchcock had been driven from Cheapside for the moment, but he had also witnessed the depth of public affection for the quack. He realized that the legal system, for all its statutes and regulations, could not eradicate the demand for cheap remedies. The poor would always seek out the lowest price, and if the legitimate apothecaries could not meet that price, the street sellers would thrive. The real solution, Grindle mused, was not suppression, but competition. A way to offer affordable medicines without compromising quality. But how could he do that and still pay his own rent, his guild fees, his wholesale costs? It was a puzzle that seemed to have no solution. Over the following weeks, Spatchcock did not return to Cheapside. Instead, he reappeared in a different market, Smithfield, where the cattle fairs drew a different crowd, and his lozenges were as popular as ever. He had learned to be cautious. He now employed a lookout who would warn him of approaching constables, and he varied his pitch depending on the day of the week. On Monday, he was a herbalist from the countryside. On Wednesday, he was a retired naval surgeon. On Friday, he was simply a friend to the poor. His lozenges remained the same crude sugar drops, but his stories changed, and each new tale brought a fresh wave of customers. Grindle, receiving reports of these sightings from his more loyal patrons, felt a growing sense of futility. He had tried to fight the quack through the proper channels, and the proper channels had failed. The law was a blunt instrument, and Spatchcock was a slippery eel. But Grindle's frustration was not solely professional, it was also personal. He had begun to suspect that some of his own apprentices, over the years, had left his shop not for better wages, but for the freedom of the street trade. He could not prove it, but he had heard rumours that a former assistant named John Barlow was now selling lozenges near the Tower of London, using a recipe suspiciously similar to Grindle's own. The thought stung. He had trained Barlow, taught him to weigh, to boil, to keep a clean ledger. And now Barlow was using that training to undercut him, to compete with him in the same crowded marketplace. Grindle felt a sense of betrayal that went deeper than mere commercial rivalry. He had given Barlow a craft, a skill that could have led to guild membership and respectability. Instead, Barlow had chosen the path of the mountebank, and Grindle could not understand why. Perhaps, Grindle reflected, the answer lay in the very nature of the apothecary's trade. It demanded patience, precision, and a willingness to submit to authority, all qualities that were not universally valued. The street trade, by contrast, offered immediate rewards, independence, and a certain anarchic joy. For a young man with ambition, but no capital, the prospect of setting up a crate and a bell was far more enticing than a long, underpaid apprenticeship. The guild system, for all its attempts to maintain standards, was also a barrier to entry. It protected the established apothecaries, like Grindle, but it also excluded the restless and the inventive. The quacks, in their way, were the entrepreneurs of their age, and they filled a gap that the guilds had left open. Now, as Grindle sits in his shop on a quiet evening, his fingers tracing the edge of his brass scale, he finds himself wondering about the future. He knows that spatchcock will not disappear, and he knows that Barlow and others like him will continue to sell their cheap lozenges on the streets. He also knows that his own customers, especially the poorer ones, will continue to buy from them, because a penny saved is a penny earned. He cannot change that reality. He can only adapt to it. Perhaps, he thinks, he might lower his prices slightly, or offer a simpler, cheaper lozenge for those who cannot afford his standard quality. He might even, with a sigh of resignation, begin to sell his own lozenges from a tray outside his shop, just as spatchcock does. It would be a compromise, a surrender to the forces of commerce, but it might also be a way to reclaim some of the lost ground. Yet, even as he entertains this thought, he recoils from it. He is a guild apothecary, a man of standards and traditions. He cannot simply become a street seller, no matter how tempting the economics. His reputation, his identity, his very sense of self is tied to the shop, the ledger, the guild certificate. If he abandons those, what is he? He is nothing but another charlatan in a red coat. No, he must find another way, a way that preserves his dignity while still serving the poor. He must think of a strategy that Spatchcock, with his crates and bells, could never replicate. A strategy rooted in trust, continuity, and genuine care. And as he drifts towards sleep, the outlines of that strategy begin to form in his mind, faintly, like the first light of dawn creeping over the rooftops. But before he can fully articulate it, he must face one more encounter with the quack, an encounter that will force him to look beyond the rivalry and see the man beneath the red coat. A man who is not so different from himself, a man who also struggles to make a living, to find meaning, to sleep at night. That encounter will come in the final section of this story, and it will test everything Grindle believes about honesty, deception, and the strange, shifting boundary between cure and comfort. Section 3. The Shared Hearth and the Unspoken Truce. The encounter that Grindle had been dreading, and, in a strange way, anticipating, came not on a busy market day, nor in the presence of a jeering crowd, but on a raw, foggy November evening, when the streets of London had emptied of all but the most determined souls. Grindle had stayed late in his shop, cleaning his copper pans and inventorying his jars of dried herbs, when a soft knock came at his side door, the door that led not to the street, but to the narrow alley where his apprentices once fetched water from the communal pump. He opened it cautiously, expecting a neighbour in need of a late-night remedy. Instead, he found Jeremiah Spatchcock, shivering in his faded red coat, his brass bell tucked into his pocket, his face pale and drawn. Grindle's first instinct was to slam the door. This was the man who had undercut his trade, who had stolen his customers, who had mocked the guild and its regulations. But something in Spatchcock's expression gave him pause, a look of genuine desperation, not theatrical performance. The quack was not here to sell, he was here to us. His voice, when he spoke, was hoarse and thin, stripped of its usual bravado. "Mr. Grindle," he said, "I know we are not friends, but I have walked 12 miles today, and I cannot find my lodgings. My landlady has locked me out, and I have not a penny for a tavern. Might I sit by your fire for an hour, just to warm my hands?" Grindle stood in the doorway, the cold air swirling around him, and he felt a conflict of loyalties. He could turn the man away, as the law and his guild would advise. But he was also a Christian, and he had never been able to refuse a request for shelter. He stepped aside, wordlessly, and motioned Spatchcock inside. The quack entered the shop with an awkward humility that Grindle had never witnessed. He removed his tricorn hat and held it in both hands, as if he were in a church. He looked around the familiar space, the counter, the brass scales, the rows of labeled jars, and he seemed to see it not as a rival's domain, but as a sanctuary. Grindle gestured to the chair by the hearth, and Spatchcock sank into it with a heavy sigh, stretching his hands toward the flames. The firelight flickered across his face, and for the first time, Grindle saw the lines of age and wear that the red coat and the brass bell had always concealed. This was not a young man. He was perhaps 50, perhaps older, with thinning hair and a slight tremor in his fingers. Grindle, uncertain of what to say, busied himself with a kettle, heating water for tea. He did not offer Spatchcock his usual sage blend. He made a simple infusion of chamomile, which he thought might soothe the man's nerves. He placed a cup on the table beside the quack, and Spatchcock accepted it with a murmured thanks. They sat in silence for several minutes, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the faint rustle of a loose shutter in the wind. Grindle studied the man across from him, and he found himself seeing not a mountebank, but a fellow tradesman who had fallen on hard times. The rivalry, in this moment, seemed almost absurd, a petty squabble over pennies in a world full of greater suffering. Spatchcock finally broke the silence. He did not apologize for his past actions, nor did he defend them. Instead, he began to talk, slowly and haltingly, about his life. He had been born in a small village in Somerset, the son of a hedge cutter who had died when he was 9. He had been sent to work as a stable boy, then as a porter, then as a sailor on a merchant ship that travelled to the West Indies. He had seen sugar plantations, had tasted the bitter life of the enslaved, had learned that the world was not kind to the poor. When he returned to England, he had no trade, no family, no prospects. He had fallen in with a troupe of travelling performers, mountebanks, jugglers, and fortune-tellers, and he had learned the art of selling remedies from an old woman who claimed to be a gypsy. She had taught him the basic recipes: sugar, mint, a dash of aniseed, and a confident voice. She had also taught him that most people do not want a cure. They want a story, a moment of escape from their grim realities. Grindle listened, his tea growing cold in his hands. He had never considered the quack's background, never imagined that there was a human history behind the brass bell. He had seen only the surface: the red coat, the loud voice, the cheap lozenges, and he had judged harshly. Now, he heard a tale of poverty, displacement, and survival that was not so different from his own family's story. His own father had been a small farmer who lost his land to enclosures, and Grindle had only become an apothecary through the charity of a distant uncle who paid for his apprenticeship. He had been lucky. Spatchcock had been unlucky. The difference between them was not one of character, but of circumstance. Spatchcock continued, his voice growing more reflective. He confessed that he knew his lozenges were not true cures. He knew that they were mostly sugar, that they would not cure a fever or mend a broken bone. But he also believed, with a simple, unshakable faith, that they did no harm. He had seen people with terminal illnesses, people who were beyond the help of any physician, and he had seen them take his lozenges and smile, not because the lozenges had healed them, but because the sweetness had reminded them that there was still pleasure in the world. He believed, in his own way, that he was a healer of spirits, if not of bodies. He admitted that he sometimes exaggerated the claims of his lozenges, but he insisted that he never knowingly lied about dangerous ingredients. He never used mercury never used anything that had killed his customers. He used sugar, mint, and a few harmless herbs. That was all. And he priced it so that the poorest could afford it. Grindle felt a shift within himself, a small but significant movement of the heart. He had been so focused on the legal and professional violations that he had overlooked the human necessity that spatchcock served. The quack was not a criminal. He was a stopgap, a safety valve for a society that had no other provision for the poor. The guild apothecaries, for all their training and standards, could not reach the lowest levels of the population. Spatchcock could, and he did. He filled a gap that Grindle's own trade could not fill, simply because the economics of a fixed shop made it impossible. The realization was uncomfortable, but it was also liberating. Grindle no longer had to see Spatchcock as an enemy. He could see him as a strange, imperfect partner in the vast, chaotic enterprise of keeping Londoners alive. He did not say all of this to Spatchcock. He simply asked, "What will you do now, if your landlady has turned you out?" Spatchcock shrugged, a gesture of weary resignation. "I will find another room tomorrow," he said. "I have a few shillings saved, and I will go back to Smithfield, or perhaps to Billingsgate. The constables do not trouble me there. I will sell my drops, and I will live. That is all I know how to do." Grindle nodded slowly. He did not offer to hire Spatchcock. That would be unthinkable, a violation of every guild rule. But he did something that surprised them both. He reached into a drawer, pulled out a small bag of his own lozenges, the proper ones, made with horehound and licorice, and handed them to Spatchcock. "Take these," he said. "They are not your kind, but they are honest. If you ever find yourself in need of a proper remedy, you can tell your customers that you have a supply from a reputable source. It will not harm your reputation." Spatchcock stared at the bag, his eyes glistening in the firelight. He understood the gesture for what it was. An offer of truce, a recognition of common humanity. He took the bag and tucked it inside his coat, next to his brass bell. "I shall not forget this, Mr. Grindle," he said. "And I shall not sell them in your parish. I will go further south, to Southwark. You will not see me again." Grindle did not argue. He knew that Spatchcock would keep his word, not out of fear, but out of gratitude. The two men sat in silence for a little while longer, the fire dying down, the fog pressing against the windows. Then Spatchcock rose, put on his tricorn hat, and extended his hand. Grindle took it, and they shook firmly, like two merchants sealing a bargain. After Spatchcock had slipped back into the alley and disappeared into the fog, Grindle stood by the door, feeling the cold air on his face. He realized that he had made a decision, a quiet one, that would shape the rest of his career. He would not seek to suppress the street sellers any longer. He would petition the society to establish a network of charitable dispensaries where the poor could receive proper medicines at reduced cost. Not free, because that would invite abuse, but cheap enough to compete with the quacks. He would use his influence, his reputation, and his knowledge to build a system that did not exclude the destitute. It would take years, and it would face opposition from the more conservative guild members, but he was determined to try. The rivalry with Spatchcock had taught him that the poor would always seek out the cheapest option, and that the only way to win their trust was to offer them something better, not something more expensive. And so, as Grindle finally closed his shop for the night and climbed the stairs to his bed, he thought not of the quack as an enemy, but as a mirror. In Spatchcock's ragged coat and worn face, he had seen his own potential fate. A fall from grace, a loss of standing, a descent into desperation. And in his own shop, he had seen what the quack could never have: security, respectability, and a legacy that would outlast him. The rivalry was over, not because one had defeated the other, but because both had realized that they were serving the same master: the human need for comfort in a harsh world. Spatchcock would continue to sell his sugar drops, and Grindle would continue to compound his lozenges, and both would continue to exist in the same city, separated by class and training, but united by a shared purpose. As you, dear listener, let these thoughts settle into your mind, Consider the quiet lesson of this encounter. In a world that often frames everything as competition, one trade against another, one class against another, one truth against another, there is a deeper, more restful understanding to be found. Sometimes the greatest victories are not won, but surrendered. Sometimes the greatest clarity comes not from drawing a line, but from erasing it. And sometimes the most profound cure is not a lozenge or a potion, but the simple act of sitting by a fire with a man you once called an enemy and sharing a cup of tea. The sugar in Spatchcock's drops and the honey in Grindle's syrups are both, in the end, metaphors for the same human longing, a longing for sweetness in a bitter world. Whether that sweetness comes from a guild-certified mortar or a brass bell and a red coat, it is still sweetness, and it is still worth preserving. The final question, as you drift towards sleep, is this: where do you find your own sweetness, your own comfort, in the routine of your days? And are you willing to see it, even in places where you least expect it? Story 3. The Rhubarb Root. How a Bitter Root Became a Gentle Staple. Section 1. The Wrinkled Finger from Cathay. Let us return, once more, to the warm, cluttered interior of Thomas Grindle's shop, but this time we shall not linger on the lozenges or the syrups. Instead, let your gaze drift to a small, square glass jar on the highest shelf behind the brass scales, partly obscured by a hanging bunch of dried lavender. The jar is not large, perhaps 6 inches tall, and it contains what looks, at first glance, like a handful of dried twigs or the gnarled roots of some ancient hedge. But these are no ordinary roots. They are pieces of Rheum palmatum, the true medicinal rhubarb brought across half the world from the high plateaus of Tibet and the cold valleys of western China. They are wrinkled, brownish yellow, and faintly dustier, and when Grindle occasionally takes down the jar to inspect them, they give off a peculiar odor, earthy, astringent, and vaguely medicinal, with a hint of something almost sweet lurking beneath the bitterness. You might wonder why such a humble-looking root deserves a place of honor in an apothecary's shop above the more colorful lozenges and the fragrant syrups. The answer, dear listener, is that this root is worth more, ounce for ounce, than silver. In the year 1740, a pound of genuine rhubarb root could fetch as much as 10 shillings, a sum that would buy a laborer a week's worth of bread and cheese, and the finest specimens, known as Turkey rhubarb or Russian rhubarb, were reserved for the wealthy and the aristocratic. It was a medicine for the privileged, a purgative for the powerful, a bitter cure that tasted of distant mountains and ancient trade routes. But that is only half the story, for within this wrinkled root lies a quiet revolution, a gradual transformation from an exotic, expensive drug into a gentle and everyday staple that even the poorest could afford. Let us walk with Grindle as he climbs onto a small stool to reach the jar. He unscrews the lid and removes a single piece, holding it up to the candlelight so that you can see its texture. It is woody, fibrous, and cross-cut with faint rings like the stump of a tiny tree. He offers it to you to smell, and you detect a sharp, clean bitterness that makes your nostrils tingle. He then takes a small grater, the kind used for nutmeg, and scrapes a fine powder from the surface into a mortar. The powder is a pale, dusty yellow, and when he adds a few drops of warm water, it turns into a dark, treacly paste that smells even more potent. That, he explains, is the essence of rhubarb, a purgative that cleanses the bowels, cools the blood, and opens the obstructions of the liver. He does not prescribe it lightly. It is a powerful medicine, and he uses it only for those who are genuinely constipated, bilious, or feverish. He adds a generous amount of sugar syrup and a pinch of cinnamon to make it palatable, but he warns you that the bitterness will never fully disappear. Now, let us step back from the shop and consider the long, arduous journey that this root has taken to reach Grindle's shelf. The true rhubarb of the pharmacopoeia came not from the common garden plant that we eat in pies. That is a different species, Rheum rhubarbarum, which was not widely cultivated for food until the 19th century. The medicinal rhubarb came from the high mountains of the Himalayas and the Tibetan plateau, where it grew wild in the thin, cold air, its thick roots burrowing deep into the rocky soil. For centuries, Tibetan and Chinese gatherers harvested these roots, dried them over low fires, and packed them into bales for the long overland journey to the west. They traveled along the ancient Silk Road, passing through the hands of Mongolian traders, Uzbek merchants, Persian middlemen, and Russian agents, all of whom added their own markup. By the time the roots reached the great port of Archangel in Russia, they had been handled perhaps a dozen times, and their price had multiplied 100-fold. The Russians, for most of the 18th century, held a near monopoly on the European rhubarb trade. They established a state-controlled company that purchased the roots from Chinese merchants at the border town of Kyakhta, then transported them across the vast, frozen expanse of Siberia to Moscow and St. Petersburg. From there, the roots were shipped to London, Amsterdam, and Hamburg, where they were sold at auction to apothecaries and druggists. The entire process could take 2 years or more, and the quality of the roots varied wildly depending on the season, the drying methods, and the honesty of the middlemen. Some roots were adulterated with cheaper varieties. Some were artificially weighted with stones or lead. Some were simply rotten from improper drying. Grindal, like all reputable apothecaries, had to develop a keen eye for the genuine article. He knew that the best rhubarb was heavy, dense, and had a distinct yellowish-brown color when cut. The inferior sorts were light, spongy, and pale. He also knew to test it by chewing a small piece. If it was authentically bitter and astringent, with a faint, lingering sweetness, it was good. If it was merely woody and tasteless, it was rubbish. But let us consider the patients who took this precious medicine. In the humoral system of medicine that still dominated the 18th century, health was a balance of 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And disease was caused by an excess or a deficiency of any one of them. Rhubarb was classified as a cooling and drying remedy, which meant it was particularly useful for conditions of heat and moisture, fevers, jaundice, biliousness, and, most commonly, constipation. A dose of rhubarb would purge the bowels, sometimes violently, and this evacuation was thought to draw off the excess humors and restore equilibrium. It was not a pleasant experience. The bitterness of the root, even when masked with sugar, often caused nausea, cramping, and a general sense of discomfort. But patients endured it because they believed, with the fervent faith of the age, that the purge was necessary for recovery. Now, imagine yourself as a patient in Grindal's care, suffering from a sluggish digestion and a persistent headache. Grindal would take a piece of rhubarb root, grate it carefully, and mix it into a draught with honey and a little rosewater. He would tell you to drink it slowly, and to expect results within a few hours. You would taste the bitterness, and you would grimace, but you would swallow it because you trusted him. And then, perhaps, you would wait, lying in your bed, feeling the warm, cramping sensation begin in your stomach, followed by a gentle, cleansing movement that, while uncomfortable, would leave you feeling lighter and clearer-headed. In that moment, you would be grateful for the wrinkled root from distant Cathay, and you would not begrudge the 10 shillings that Grindal had charged you. But here is the curious, almost paradoxical twist in the story of medicinal rhubarb. Despite its value and its popularity, it was, for most of the 18th century, a medicine for the relatively affluent. The poor, as we have seen in previous stories, could not afford the imported root, and they resorted to cheaper alternatives: buckthorn, senna, or even the crude purgatives sold by street sellers. The rhubarb remained a symbol of elite medicine, a luxury that only the well-to-do could enjoy, that is, until a series of quiet, unheralded experiments in cultivation began to change the equation. For some years, a few ambitious English gardeners had been trying to grow rhubarb on British soil. They had obtained seeds and roots from Russian traders, and they had planted them in sheltered plots in the milder regions of the country. The early results were disappointing. The plants grew, but the roots were small, thin, and lacked the potent bitterness of the imported product. But the gardeners persisted, experimenting with different soils, different watering regimes, and different harvesting times. By the 1750s, they had made enough progress to produce a passable, though still inferior, domestic rhubarb. It was not as strong as the Turkey rhubarb, but it was cheaper, and it could be sold to a broader market. The apothecaries were initially skeptical, but they soon realized that the domestic root, while milder, could still be effective, especially when combined with other purgatives like senna or jalap. The price of rhubarb began to fall, slowly but steadily, and a medicine that had once been a luxury began to trickle down to the middle and even the lower classes. Grindal, ever the pragmatist, was among the first in his parish to purchase domestic rhubarb. He did not abandon his imported stock. He kept the finest pieces for his wealthy patients who would pay a premium for the genuine article. But he also bought a regular supply of English-grown root, which he used for his poorer customers, mixing it with sugar and ginger to make a more gentle, less bitter powder. He found that the domestic root was actually easier to work with. It was softer, less fibrous, and it grated more smoothly. The bitterness was reduced, which meant that his patients complained less and took their medicine more willingly. He even began to experiment with a rhubarb and cinnamon confection, a sort of pastille that could be sucked slowly, delivering a mild laxative effect without the unpleasant cramping. It was not a cure-all, but it was a gentle step in the right direction. And so, the rhubarb route, once a treacherous passage across mountains and steppes, began to narrow into a quiet English garden path. The route that had traveled halfway around the world became, in a few short decades, a familiar presence in the apothecary's drawer, no more exotic than a carrot or a turnip. The bitterness remained, but it was tempered by the familiarity of homegrown soil. The patients no longer marveled at the distant origins of their medicine. They simply accepted it as part of their daily routine, a small, bitter comfort that reminded them, in its own way, of the resilience of nature and the ingenuity of human cultivation. But there is a shadow that falls across this quiet success story. The domestic rhubarb, for all its affordability, was also less potent, and some physicians argued that it was barely a medicine at all. They claimed that the English root lacked the essential virtue of the Tibetan original, and that patients who took it were merely experiencing a weak placebo effect. Grindal, who had tested both varieties on himself, was not so sure. He had found that the domestic root still produced a measurable effect, though it was gentler and slower. He concluded that the physicians were exaggerating, as physicians often did, to preserve the mystique of imported drugs. He also suspected that the gentle effect of the domestic root might actually be preferable for the majority of patients, who did not need a violent purge, but only a mild, soothing regulation. As you sit with Grindal in his quiet shop, watching him weigh out a portion of his domestic rhubarb into a folded paper packet, you might find yourself reflecting on the strange alchemy of medical history. A root that was once a precious commodity, traded across continents and valued above gold, has become a humble household staple. The bitterness that patients once dreaded has been softened by time, by cultivation, and by the quiet ingenuity of men like Grindal. And yet, the essential question remains unanswered. Is the medicine in the root itself, or in the belief that the root will work? Does the power come from the chemistry, or from the ceremony? Grindal, as he folds the packet and writes the label, does not dwell on these questions. He is too busy with the practical work of healing. But you, from your distant vantage point, can ask them. And perhaps, as you drift towards sleep, you will find that the answer does not matter so much as the asking. Section 2. The garden plot and the apothecary's son. The domestic rhubarb that Grindal began to use in the late 1740s did not appear in his shop by accident. It was the result of years of quiet, unglamorous experimentation by a network of botanists, nurserymen, and curious amateurs who saw in this humble plant a potential that went far beyond the medicinal. One of the most persistent of these experimenters was a man named William Curtis, a botanist and apothecary who kept a small garden on the outskirts of London, where he grew not only rhubarb, but also a wide variety of medicinal herbs from around the world. Curtis was a methodical man, given to long handwritten journals in which he recorded every detail of his plant's growth. The exact date of the first shoot, the height of the stem, the color of the leaves, the size and weight of the harvested root. He corresponded with other gardeners across England, exchanging seeds, cuttings, and advice, and he gradually developed a strain of rhubarb that was more robust and more potent than the earlier domestic varieties. His work, though little known outside a small circle of fellow enthusiasts, would eventually transform the rhubarb trade. But Grindal did not learn of Curtis's work through scientific journals or botanical correspondence. He learned of it through a more personal channel, his own son, Thomas Grindal Jr., who had been sent to London to study under a prominent apothecary, and who had, in his spare time, become fascinated with the new horticultural experiments. Young Thomas, a thoughtful and observant young man of 22, had visited Curtis's garden on several occasions and had been impressed by the rows of healthy rhubarb plants, their broad leaves shading the soil beneath them. He had brought back a small packet of seeds to his father, urging him to try growing his own supply. Grindal, initially skeptical, had planted the seeds in a small patch of earth behind his shop, a space that had previously been used only for drying herbs and storing coal. He had tended the plants with the same careful attention that he gave to his copper pans and his brass scales, watering them regularly, protecting them from the harsh London frosts, and watching with growing fascination as they pushed their way through the dark soil. The first harvest, in the autumn of 1748, was modest. The roots were smaller than the imported ones, and they did not have the same intense bitterness. But Grindal was not disappointed. He was intrigued. He grated a small piece and mixed it into a draught for himself, noticing that the effect was indeed gentler. A mild, almost soothing purgation that did not cause the painful cramping that sometimes accompanied the imported root. He began to experiment with different preparations, combining the domestic rhubarb with ginger, cinnamon, and even a little clove to create a warm, aromatic powder that could be taken with a cup of tea. He found that his patients, especially the elderly and the infirm, preferred this gentler version. They did not dread their medicine. They accepted it with something approaching gratitude. And so Grindal quietly increased his cultivation, expanding his small plot and planting more seeds each year. By 1752, he was producing enough rhubarb to supply a quarter of his regular customers, and he had reduced his reliance on the expensive imported root. But the true significance of this cultivation was not simply economic, it was symbolic. The rhubarb that Grindal grew in his own backyard was no longer an exotic import from a distant land. It was a local product, rooted in English soil, tended by English hands, and consumed by English patients. It had been domesticated, in the fullest sense of the word, and in the process, it had lost some of its mystique, but gained a great deal of its utility. The patients who took it no longer felt that they were consuming a fragment of a foreign empire. They felt that they were taking a sensible, everyday remedy no more remarkable than a spoonful of honey or a pinch of salt. The bitterness remained, but it was a familiar bitterness, the bitterness of homegrown herbs and simple, honest remedies. Now, let us pause and consider the quiet drama that unfolded in Grindal's small garden, a drama that was repeated in countless other gardens across England. The cultivation of rhubarb was not a heroic enterprise. It did not involve daring explorations or groundbreaking discoveries. It involved digging, watering, weeding, the same mundane activities that gardeners had performed for centuries. But this mundane labor was, in its own way, revolutionary. It signaled a shift in the relationship between the apothecary and the natural world, from dependence on distant sources to a more localized, self-sufficient model of medicine. It also signaled a shift in the relationship between the apothecary and his patients, from the hierarchical deference of the guild system to a more reciprocal, community-based practice. Grindal was no longer just a dispenser of imported drugs. He was a cultivator, a producer, a man who grew his own remedies and took pride in their quality. Let us walk with Grindal through his garden on a mild summer evening as the sun begins to dip behind the rooftops and the long shadows stretch across the neat rows of plants. He is inspecting his rhubarb, checking the leaves for signs of blight and the soil for moisture. He pauses at one plant, its leaves broad and glossy, and he gently brushes the dirt away from the base of the stem to reveal the thick, reddish-brown root beneath. He smiles, a rare, quiet expression of satisfaction. This plant is 3 years old, and its root is nearly as large as his fist, large enough, he calculates, to provide a dozen doses of his mild rhubarb powder. He will not harvest it until the autumn, when the plant has gone dormant and the root has accumulated its maximum concentration of active compounds. He has learned this timing through patient observation, through trial and error, and through the advice of other gardeners. He has become, in his own modest way, a rhubarb expert. But there is another dimension to this story that Grindal only dimly perceives. The domestic rhubarb that he is cultivating is not just a cheaper alternative to the imported root. It is also, in the long run, a catalyst for a much broader transformation in English medicine, as more apothecaries begin to grow their own herbs, and as more gardeners experiment with new varieties, the old dependence on imported drugs begins to weaken. The physicians, who have long relied on the prestige of exotic remedies, find themselves challenged by a new generation of practitioners who advocate for local, homegrown medicines. The debate is not always civil. It sometimes descends into bitter polemics and professional rivalries. But the trend is clear. The future of medicine lies not in distant mountains, but in nearby fields and gardens. Grindal, however, is not a polemicist. He is a tradesman, and he is content to let his rhubarb speak for itself. He continues to order his small quantities of imported root for those patients who insist on the genuine article, but he quietly steers most of his customers toward his domestic supply. He finds that the gentler effect of the homegrown root actually results in fewer complaints and more repeat purchases. His reputation grows, and he begins to receive inquiries from other apothecaries who want to know his methods. He shares his knowledge freely, not out of altruism, but out of a practical understanding that a rising tide lifts all boats. If more apothecaries grow their own rhubarb, the price of the imported root will fall further, and the entire trade will become more stable. It is a calculated decision, but it is also a generous one, and it earns him a quiet respect among his peers. Now, let us return to the interior of Grindal's shop on a cool, damp morning. He is preparing a rhubarb draught for a young woman who has come to him with a persistent headache and a feeling of heaviness in her limbs. He takes a piece of his homegrown root, grates it finely, and adds it to a small glass of warm water along with a spoonful of honey and a few drops of lemon juice. He stirs the mixture slowly, watching the bitter powder dissolve into a cloudy, amber liquid. He hands the glass to the young woman, and she drinks it with a slight grimace, but she does not complain. She has heard that Grindal's rhubarb is milder than the usual purgatives, and she trusts him. She sets the glass down, thanks him, and leaves, promising to return if the headache persists. Grindal watches her go, and he feels a quiet sense of fulfillment. He has done his job. He has relieved her suffering, if only temporarily. The rhubarb has done its work, not with a dramatic purge, but with a gentle, steady regulation. As the morning wears on, Grindal continues his routine, weighing, measuring, compounding, advising. He sells a packet of rhubarb powder to a middle-aged man who complains of a sluggish digestion. He sells a small jar of rhubarb and ginger pastilles to a woman who wants to relieve her children's occasional constipation. He even sells a piece of the raw root to a local physician who is curious about the quality of the domestic variety. Each sale is small, unremarkable, and yet each one contributes to the slow, incremental change that is transforming the trade. The rhubarb, once a rare and precious import, has become a familiar, everyday commodity, as unremarkable as a loaf of bread or a pint of milk. But there is a question that lingers in the air, a question that Grindal cannot fully answer. If the domestic rhubarb is so effective, why do the physicians continue to praise the imported root? Why do the wealthy patients insist on paying 10 shillings for a pound of Turkish rhubarb when they could have a pound of domestic root for a fraction of the price? The answer, Grindal suspects, lies not in the chemistry of the root, but in the psychology of the patient. The wealthy want the best, and they define best by price and rarity. They will always prefer the exotic to the familiar, the distant to the local. Grindal does not resent this. He accepts it as a fact of human nature. But he also takes a quiet satisfaction in knowing that he can offer his poorer patients something nearly as good at a price they can afford. That is his own small victory, his own quiet rebellion against the hierarchies of his age. And so, as the afternoon sun filters through the dusty windows of his shop, Grindal continues his work, his hands steady, his mind calm. The rhubarb root in his drawer, the domestic variety that he grew in his own garden, is a testament to the power of patience and persistence. It has not transformed the world. It has not cured any great disease. It has not made him a wealthy man. But it has made his trade more sustainable, his customers more satisfied, and his own life more meaningful. And in the end, perhaps that is enough. Section 3. The Pie and the Powder, a Culinary and Medicinal Legacy. The years rolled on, as years do, and by the late 70s, Thomas Grindal had become something of an elder statesman among the apothecaries of his parish. His hair had thinned to a silvery fringe, his hands bore the permanent stains of turmeric and gentian, and his eyes had grown weaker, requiring a larger pair of spectacles for his finer work. But his mind remained sharp, and his curiosity about the rhubarb root, his own domestic rhubarb, had not diminished. In fact, it had deepened, taking on a new and unexpected dimension that would have seemed almost heretical to the apothecaries of an earlier generation. Grindal had begun to wonder if the rhubarb root, so long valued solely for its purgative properties, might have other uses beyond the medicinal. He had noticed, over the years, that some of his customers, especially the younger ones, would occasionally ask if they could taste the raw root, not as a medicine, but as a curiosity. They would chew on a small piece, grimace at the bitterness, and then ask for more. It was a strange request, but it planted a seed in Grindal's mind. The seed grew, slowly, nurtured by chance observations and quiet experiments. Grindal began to cook with his rhubarb, not in the way that a physician would cook a medicine, but in the way that a cook would prepare a dish. He took the tender young stalks of his rhubarb plants, the parts that he had previously discarded as waste, and he chopped them into small pieces, adding sugar and a little water, and simmering them over a low fire. The result was a tart, reddish compote that reminded him of the gooseberry jams he had eaten as a child. He tasted it cautiously, expecting a violent purgative effect, but nothing dramatic happened. His digestion was gently stimulated, yes, but there was no cramping, no unpleasant urgency. He had, quite by accident, discovered that the stalks of the rhubarb plant were far milder than the root, and that they could be eaten as a food, not just as a medicine. This was, in its way, a revolution. For centuries, the rhubarb plant had been valued solely for its root. The stalks were considered waste, fit only for the compost heap. But Grindal's simple experiment revealed that the stalks were not only edible, but also delicious, or at least delicious, or sweetened with sugar. He began to experiment with different preparations: rhubarb tarts, rhubarb fools, rhubarb and custard puddings. He shared his creations with his family and a few trusted friends, and he was met with enthusiasm. His son, young Thomas, who had since returned from London to work alongside his father, was particularly taken with the rhubarb tart. He urged his father to write a short pamphlet describing his culinary experiments and to distribute it among the local housewives. Grindal, ever cautious, hesitated. He did not want to be seen as abandoning his profession, nor did he want to be accused of encouraging the frivolous consumption of a medicinal plant. But he also recognized that his discovery might have genuine value for the poor, who could grow rhubarb in their own gardens and use it as a cheap source of nutrition, especially during the lean winter months when fresh fruit was scarce. The pamphlet, when it finally appeared in 1759, was modest in every way. It was a slim, unassuming booklet titled A Brief Account of the Use of Rhubarb as a Culinary Vegetable, and it sold for a few pence at Grindal's shop. It contained simple recipes, practical advice on cultivation, and a cautious disclaimer that the root remained a medicine and should be used only as directed. The public response was surprisingly warm. The pamphlet was read aloud in kitchens and market squares. It was discussed in the coffee houses that even attracted the attention of a few prominent physicians who were intrigued by the idea that a medicinal plant might have nutritional value. Within a few years, rhubarb had begun to appear on the tables of the middle classes, not as a purgative, but as a tart, tangy filling for pies and tarts. The plant that had once been a luxury import, a symbol of elite medicine, had become a common, affordable pleasure. Now, let us pause and consider the quiet irony of this transformation. The rhubarb root, which had travelled halfway around the world to reach Grindel's shop, had been valued for centuries as a powerful purgative. It had been dispensed with caution, consumed with reluctance, and praised for its bitterness. And yet, it was the humble stalks, the parts that had been thrown away, that eventually captured the public imagination. The stalks were not bitter. They were tart, refreshing, and capable of being sweetened into something genuinely pleasant. They required no exotic imports, no long journeys across mountains and steppes. They could be grown in any English garden, by any English housewife, and they could be harvested year after year without depleting the root. The plant had, in a sense, domesticated itself, or rather, it had been domesticated by the quiet perseverance of men like Grindel. But there was a deeper consequence to this culinary discovery, one that Grindel did not fully anticipate. As rhubarb became more common as a food, its medicinal reputation began to change. The patients who had once dreaded the bitter draught of rhubarb root now associated the plant with pleasant memories of pies and puddings. They no longer feared it, they welcomed it. This shift in perception made it easier for Grindel to prescribe rhubarb as a gentle tonic, because his patients no longer approached it with suspicion and dread. They had tasted its sweetness, and they trusted it. The placebo effect, always a powerful force in medicine, was now working in Grindel's favor. The patient who believed that rhubarb was good for them was more likely to respond positively to the root, even if the actual dose was mild. Grindel did not fully understand the psychology at play, but he knew enough to encourage the association. He began to keep a small dish of rhubarb comfit on his counter, offering a taste to any customer who seemed hesitant about taking the root. It was a small, shrewd gesture, and it worked. Let us walk with Grindel through his garden on a bright autumn afternoon, just as the rhubarb plants are beginning to yellow and die back for the winter. He is not harvesting the root today. He is harvesting the last of the stalks, which he will cook into a compote for his evening meal. He works slowly, deliberately, cutting each stalk at the base with a sharp knife and laying it in a woven basket. The stalks are thick and reddish, tinged with green at the tips, and they give off a faint, sour aroma that is surprisingly pleasant. He carries the basket into his kitchen, where his wife is waiting with a copper pan and a bag of sugar. Together, they chop the stalks, simmer them slowly, and fill a small clay pot with the resulting compote. They will eat it with their supper, and they will enjoy it. This is not a medicine. It is a food, a simple, honest pleasure that connects them to the earth and to each other. Grindel does not think of himself as a pioneer. He thinks of himself as a man who has grown a few vegetables and shared them with his neighbors. He does not know that his experiments with rhubarb will eventually spread across England and beyond, transforming the plant from a medicinal curiosity into a staple of the British kitchen. He does not know that the rhubarb pie will become a beloved dessert, a symbol of homely comfort, a taste of childhood for generations to come. He does not know that the root, once valued above silver, will become a commodity so common that it will be sold by the pound in every grocery shop. He knows only that he has found a new way to use a familiar plant, and that it gives him a quiet, unshowy satisfaction. But there is one more chapter in this story, a chapter that Grindel will not live to see. In the decades following his death, the cultivation of rhubarb will expand dramatically, driven by a growing demand for cheap, nutritious food. New varieties will be developed, yielding larger stalks and more tender flesh. The forced rhubarb, grown in dark sheds to produce pale, sweet shoots, will become a winter delicacy, fetching high prices in the London markets. The medicinal root will continue to be harvested, but it will be overshadowed by the culinary uses of the plant, which will become far more profitable. And yet, the old knowledge will not be lost. The apothecaries will still keep their jars of dried root, and they will still prescribe it as a gentle purgative, a bitter tonic, a reminder of the distant mountains where it all began. Now, let us return to Grindel in his final years. He is old, and his hands are not as steady as they once were. He has passed the shop to his son, young Thomas, who now runs the business with the same quiet efficiency that his father exhibited. But Grindal still likes to visit the garden, to sit on a wooden bench in the afternoon sun, and to watch the rhubarb plants grow. He does not have the strength to dig or to harvest. He simply observes, taking pleasure in the green leaves and the sturdy stalks. He thinks about the long journey of the rhubarb root from the Tibetan plateau to his own backyard, and he marvels at the strangeness of it all. He thinks about the patients he has treated, the lozenges he has made, the purges he has administered, and he wonders if any of it really mattered. He decides, in the end, that it did matter, not because he cured anyone. He knows that death comes for everyone, eventually, but because he offered comfort. He offered a bitter root that became a gentle staple, a source of warmth and sweetness in a world that was often cold and bitter. As you, dear listener, let these thoughts settle into your mind, consider the quiet legacy of the rhubarb. It is a legacy of transformation, of a bitter thing becoming sweet, of a medicine becoming a food, of a distant import becoming a local treasure. It is a reminder the world is full of strange, unexpected connections, and that even the most humble plant can have a story worth telling. And as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you will dream of rhubarb pies and gentle purges, of warm kitchens and cool gardens, of the long, winding road that brought this bitter root from the mountains of Tibet to the soil of England, and to your own quiet imagination. Story 4. The Widow's Recipe. Female Apothecaries, Behind the Counter, Section 1. The Hidden Hands of the Mortar. Let us step once more into the warm, cluttered world of Thomas Grindal's shop, but this time, let us look not at the shelves or the scales, but at the figure standing quietly in the corner, half hidden behind a hanging cluster of dried rosemary. She is a woman of perhaps 45, dressed in a plain grey gown and a starched white apron, her hair pulled back under a simple linen cap. Her hands, like Grindal's, are stained with the faint yellow of turmeric and the deep brown of gentian root. She is not a customer. She is a worker, an assistant, a presence so familiar that Grindal himself barely notices her. Her name is Mrs. Eleanor Slaughter, and she has been working in this shop for nearly 12 years, ever since her husband, a sailor, was lost at sea, and she found herself alone with 3 children and no means of support. Grindal, who had known her as a customer, had offered her a position as a cleaner and general help. But Eleanor had other ideas. She had watched the apothecary work, had observed his measurements, his decoctions, his careful record keeping, and she had asked, with a quiet determination, if she might learn the trade. Grindal had been hesitant at first. The apothecary's trade, like most trades, was dominated by men. Women were not forbidden from working as apothecaries. There was no specific law against it, but they were discouraged, overlooked, and often dismissed as incapable of the rigorous training required. The Guild, the worshipful society of apothecaries, did not admit women, but the Guild did not regulate all apothecaries, especially those who worked in smaller shops or in the poorer parishes. There was a grey area, a space where a determined woman could carve out a niche for herself, if she had the patience and the nerve. Eleanor Slaughter had both. She had persuaded Grindal to let her help with the simpler tasks, washing the jars, sweeping the floor, labeling the dried herbs, and she had gradually, over the years, taken on more complex responsibilities. She could now compound a draught, weigh a dose of rhubarb, and even mix a batch of lozenges with a skill that would have done credit to any apprentice. She was not a licensed apothecary, but she was an apothecary in all but name. Now, let us sit with Eleanor as she works, grinding a small quantity of cinnamon bark in the heavy brass mortar. Her movements are rhythmic, almost meditative, the pestle turning in a steady circular motion that she has repeated thousands of times. She does not look at her hands. She looks out the window, where the morning fog is slowly lifting over the rooftops. She is thinking, as she often does, about her children. Her eldest son, now 17, who has just taken up an apprenticeship with a cabinet maker, her daughter cabinet maker 15, who helps at a local milliner's shop, and her youngest, a boy of 10, who still clings to her apron strings and asks her every evening to tell him stories about the medicine woman of the village where she grew up. Eleanor does not think of herself as a medicine woman. She thinks of herself as a working mother, a widow, who has learned to make her way in a world that was not designed for her. But the title has a certain appeal, a certain dignity, and she allows her son to use it because it makes him proud. Let us consider, for a moment, the world that Eleanor navigated every day. The 1740s and 1750s were a time of transition for women in the medical trades. In the centuries before, women had played a prominent role in healing, as midwives, herbalists, and wise women. But the rise of the guilds and the professionalization of medicine had pushed them to the margins. The physicians, with their university degrees and their Latin texts, viewed women practitioners with suspicion. The apothecaries, with their guild certificates and their 7-year apprenticeships, viewed them as competitors. And the public, fed by pamphlets and satirical prints, often mocked them as quacks and old wives. But the demand for healers was too great, and the supply of male apothecaries too small, for women to be entirely excluded. In the poorer parishes, in the rural villages, and in the bustling market towns, women continued to practice medicine, often with a practical skill that rivaled that of their male counterparts. They were not licensed, they were not respected, but they were needed. And that need, quiet and persistent, kept the door open for women like Eleanor. Grindal, for his part, had come to value Eleanor's work more than he would ever admit. She was reliable, meticulous, and uncomplaining. She never asked for a raise, never demanded better hours, never questioned his authority. But more than that, she had a gift for dealing with the women customers who came to the shop. The women of the parish, especially the mothers with young children, were often reluctant to speak openly with a male apothecary about their ailments. They were embarrassed, shy, or simply unable to articulate their symptoms in the formal language that Grindal expected. But they would talk to Eleanor. They would tell her about their monthly cycles, their pregnancy complaints, their nursing troubles, and their children's fevers. Eleanor would listen, nod sympathetically, and then quietly suggest a remedy. A chamomile tea, a ginger compress, a mild rhubarb powder that Grindal would never have thought to offer. She knew the women's bodies better than he did, not because she had studied anatomy, but because she had lived in a woman's body and had shared their experiences. Let us listen to a conversation between Eleanor and a young mother who has just entered the shop, a baby on her hip and a worried expression on her face. The mother, Sarah, is a servant in a nearby household, and she has been nursing her baby for 8 months. But her milk has begun to dwindle, and the baby is restless and hungry. She is afraid to consult a physician, who would charge a fee that she cannot afford, and she is equally afraid to trust the street sellers, whose remedies might be dangerous. She has come to Grindal's shop because she has heard that the widow is a good listener. Eleanor takes Sarah into a small, private room at the back of the shop, where she can speak without being overheard. She asks a few gentle questions. Is the baby sleeping well? Is he gaining weight? Are there any signs of fever? Sarah answers hesitantly, and Eleanor nods. She suggests a simple remedy, a tea made from fennel seeds and a little honey, which will help to stimulate the milk flow, and a gentle diet of oatmeal and broth. She also recommends that Sarah try to rest more, to drink plenty of water, and to nurse the baby more frequently, especially at night. Sarah is relieved. The advice is practical, affordable, and delivered with a kindness that she has rarely encountered in the medical world. She leaves the shop with a small packet of fennel seeds and a renewed sense of hope. This is the work of the female apothecary, quiet, unglamorous, and often unnoticed. Eleanor does not write prescriptions, she gives advice. She does not perform surgeries, she offers comfort. She does not publish papers, she shares wisdom, passed down through generations of women, refined by experience, and adapted to the needs of her community. She is not a physician, not a guild member, not a recognized expert. But she is a healer, in the truest sense of the word, and her patients know it. Now, let us consider the challenges that Eleanor faced in her daily work. She was not paid the same as a male apprentice would have been. Grindal gave her a small weekly wage, just enough to keep her and her children fed, and he did not offer her the formal training that would have allowed her to join the guild. He was not being deliberately cruel. He was simply following the customs of his time, which dictated that women's work was worth less than men's. But Eleanor, for her part, did not complain. She knew that she was fortunate to have any position at all, and she valued the independence that her small income provided. She also knew that her work was, in its way, a form of resistance. A quiet assertion that women could be skilled, knowledgeable, and useful, even when the system denied them recognition. Let us visit Eleanor in her small lodgings, a single room above a chandler's shop, where she lives with her youngest son. The room is modest, furnished with a narrow bed, a wooden table, and a few shelves of books, mostly herbals and medical texts that she has borrowed from Grindle over the years. There is a small pot of mint growing on the windowsill, and the air is fragrant with the scent of dried lavender. In the evenings, after a long day at the shop, Eleanor sits at this table and reads, by the light of a single candle, her lips moving slowly as she deciphers the Latin names of the plants. She is teaching herself, patiently, methodically, because she knows that knowledge is the only path to advancement. She has also begun to keep her own notebooks, recording the remedies she has learned and the results they have produced. She is, in her own quiet way, building a medical practice, one that she hopes to pass on to her daughter, who has shown an interest in the trade. But there are clouds on the horizon. The physicians, who have long resented the encroachment of apothecaries into their territory, are beginning to turn their attention to women healers. In the 1740s, a series of pamphlets and articles appeared denouncing ignorant women who practiced medicine without proper training. The attacks were often vicious, accusing female healers of witchcraft, incompetence, and even murder. Eleanor does not read these pamphlets, but she hears about them from the customers who bring them into the shop. She tries not to let them unsettle her, but she knows that the climate is changing and that women like her are being pushed to the margins. She also knows that Grindle, for all his kindness, will not protect her if the pressure becomes too great. He is a cautious man, and he values his guild connections more than he values her. And yet, Eleanor persists. She continues to come to the shop every morning, to grind the herbs, to weigh the powders, to advise the women who seek her out. She does not ask for recognition. She does not demand a title. She simply works. She knows that her work matters, even if no one says so. She knows that the women who come to her are grateful, even if they cannot always express it. And she knows that she is part of a long, unbroken tradition of female healers, stretching back to the wise women of the Middle Ages and beyond. That knowledge, quiet and steady, sustains her. Now, let us step back and consider the larger picture. Eleanor's story is not unique. It is repeated, with variations, in thousands of towns and villages across England. Women like her are the unsung heroes of 18th century medicine, the hidden hands that keep the sick and the poor alive. They are not celebrated in the history books. They are not remembered in the annals of the guilds, but they are everywhere, in the kitchens and the gardens, in the shops and the market stalls, offering their remedies and their comfort, asking nothing in return, but the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Their legacy is not one of fame, but of resilience. It is a legacy that we would do well to remember, especially as we drift towards sleep, in a world that owes them more than it knows. But there is a question that lingers, a question that will shape the next section of this story. What happens when a woman like Eleanor, with her knowledge and her skill, begins to seek not just survival, but recognition? What happens when she dares to dream of a guild membership, a certificate, a name of her own? The answer, as we will discover, is both heartbreaking and inspiring. A tale of small victories and larger defeats, of a woman who dared to reach for something more, and who found that the world was not quite ready to let her grasp it. Section 2. The guild's closed door and the widow's resolve. The year was 17054, and the air in London was thick with more than just the usual fog. A new energy crackled through the streets, a restlessness that seemed to touch every trade, every guild, every household. The newspapers were filled with debates about reform, about rights, about the proper order of society. And in the quiet back room of Thomas Grindle's shop, Eleanor Slaughter was reading a pamphlet that would change the course of her life. It was not a medical text, nor a herbal, nor a recipe book. It was a slim, anonymous tract titled A Modest Proposal for the Admission of Women to the Guilds, and it argued, with surprising force, that the exclusion of women from the trades was not only unjust, but also economically foolish. The pamphlet had been circulating among the more radical coffee houses, and a customer had left it on the counter, perhaps by accident, perhaps by accident, perhaps by design. Eleanor had picked it up, read it through twice, and felt a stirring in her chest that she had not felt since her husband's death. The pamphlet did not call for revolution. It called for practical reform. It pointed out that many widows, like Eleanor, were forced to support themselves and their children in low-paying, menial jobs, even though they possessed the skills and knowledge to practice a trade. It argued that admitting women to the guilds would increase competition, lower prices, and benefit the public. It also noted, somewhat wryly, that women had been practicing medicine and pharmacy for centuries, and that the guild's attempts to exclude them were based more on prejudice than on any rational assessment of their abilities. Eleanor read these words and felt a profound sense of validation. She was not alone. She was not invisible. There were others who saw the injustice and were willing to speak out against it. Emboldened by the pamphlet, Eleanor began to entertain a thought that had previously seemed impossible. She would apply for membership in the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries. She knew that the society did not formally admit women, but she also knew that the rules were not as rigid as they appeared. The society's charter, dating back to 1617, did not explicitly forbid women from joining. It simply said that members must be fit and proper persons who had served a 7-year apprenticeship. Nowhere did it say that an apprentice had to be male. The exclusion of women was a matter of custom, not of law. And custom, Eleanor reasoned, could be challenged. She would need a sponsor, a master apothecary who would vouch for her skills and her character. She would need to prove that she had served her 7 years. Not formally, but practically, through her years of work in Grindle's shop. And she would need the courage to face the inevitable opposition. She approached Grindle on a quiet Tuesday morning, when the shop was empty and the fire was crackling gently in the hearth. She told him of her intention, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. Grindle listened in silence, his face unreadable. He had known Eleanor for more than a decade. He had watched her work, had trusted her with his recipes, had relied on her to keep the shop running smoothly. He respected her skill and her dedication. But he was also a man of his time, a member of the guild, a creature of habit. The thought of sponsoring a woman for membership was almost incomprehensible to him. It would be seen as a breach of trust, a betrayal of his fellow apothecaries. It could damage his reputation, his business, his standing in the community. He hesitated, and in that hesitation, Eleanor saw the limits of his goodwill. Grindle did not refuse outright. He was too gentle for that. He told Eleanor that he would need to think about it, to consult with his colleagues, to consider the implications. He asked her to be patient, to wait for a few weeks, to let him find the right moment to raise the matter with the society. Eleanor nodded, hiding her disappointment. She knew that waiting often meant forgetting, and that the right moment might never come. But she had learned patience in her years of widowhood, and she was willing to wait, for a little while at least. She returned to her work, grinding the herbs, weighing the powders, advising the customers, and she tried to push the thought of the guild to the back of her mind. But the thought would not stay buried. It surfaced every time she saw a new apothecary open a shop, every time she read a pamphlet about the rights of women, every time a female customer told her that she was better than the physician. Eleanor began to keep a private journal, a small leather-bound book that she hid under her mattress, in which she recorded her thoughts and her plans. She wrote about the remedies she had developed, the patients she had treated, the letters she might write to the society, the arguments she might make. She also wrote about her fears. The fear of rejection, the fear of ridicule, the fear of being cast out from the only livelihood she had ever known. The journal became her confidant, a silent witness to her ambition and her doubt. Let us sit with Eleanor in her small room, late one evening, as she writes by candlelight. Her son is asleep in the corner, his breathing soft and regular. The rain is pattering against the window, and the room is filled with the scent of damp wool and drying herbs. Eleanor dips her quill in the ink and writes, "I have resolved to petition the society. Come what may, I shall not let their rules and their customs bind me. I have served my time. I have learned my craft. I have healed many. If they will not admit me, they must tell me why, and they must answer to the women who need me." She reads the words back to herself, and she feels a surge of determination. She will not be silent. She will not be invisible. She will make her voice heard. The weeks passed, and Grindal did not raise the matter with the society. He was not being deliberately obstructive. He was simply overwhelmed by his own concerns. A cold that had settled in his chest, a dispute with a supplier, the troublesome new apprentice, who could not seem to learn the difference between an ounce and a dram. Eleanor watched him, and she saw that he would not act on her behalf. She would have to act on her own. So she wrote a letter to the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries, a formal and respectful petition requesting that they consider her application for membership. She enclosed a testimonial from Grindal, which he had reluctantly provided after some persuasion, and a detailed list of her qualifications, including the years she had worked in the shop, the remedies she had compounded, and the patients she had treated. She sent the letter by messenger, and she waited. The response came 6 weeks later in the form of a terse, official letter. The society thanked her for her interest, but regretted to inform her that the admission of women to the guild is not consistent with the customs and practices of this honorable body. They did not explain why. They did not cite any rule or statute. They simply stated that her application had been considered and found to be unsuitable. The letter was signed by the clerk of the society, and it bore the official seal. Eleanor read it in the back room of the shop, her hands trembling, her eyes stinging with tears that she refused to shed. She had expected rejection, but she had not expected it to be so cold, so dismissive, so devoid of any acknowledgement of her work or her worth. But Eleanor was not defeated. She read the letter again, and she noticed something that she had missed on the first reading. The letter did not say that women were forbidden from the guild. It said that their admission was not consistent with customs and practices. That was a statement of tradition, not of law. It was an opinion, not of rule. And opinions, Eleanor knew, could be changed. She would not challenge the society directly. That would be foolish and fruitless. Instead, she would find another way. She would continue her work, quietly and steadily, and she would build a reputation that could not be ignored. She would become so indispensable, so respected, so well known, that the society would eventually be forced to recognize her, or risk looking foolish and outdated. And so, Eleanor began to expand her practice. She did not open her own shop. She lacked the capital and the guild license, but she began to see patients in their homes, visiting the sick and the infirm, offering her remedies and her advice. She charged modest fees, often accepting payment in kind: a loaf of bread, a basket of eggs, a bundle of firewood. She built a network of loyal clients who trusted her implicitly and who spread her reputation by word of mouth. She also began to write, publishing a series of small, practical pamphlets on the care of infants, the treatment of common ailments, and the preparation of simple remedies. The pamphlets were not scholarly. They were plain, direct, and written in the language of the people. They sold for a few pence, and they made Eleanor a name beyond her parish. Let us consider one of Eleanor's pamphlets, a modest booklet titled A Plain Guide for the Nursing Mother. It opens with a gentle, reassuring tone. The author, a mother of 3, has compiled these observations from her own experience and from the wisdom of many women to be a comfort and a help to all who nurse their infants. The booklet covers everything from the proper diet for nursing mothers to the treatment of sore nipples to the signs of a thriving baby. It is full of practical advice, grounded in common sense rather than in medical theory. It advises women to drink plenty of warm liquids, to avoid spicy foods, to rest when they can, and to trust their bodies. It also includes a few simple remedies: fennel tea for milk supply, chamomile compresses for engorgement, and a gentle rhubarb powder for constipation, in very small doses, for the baby. The booklet is not a medical treatise. It is a survival guide, a piece of sisterly wisdom passed from woman to woman. The pamphlet was well received, and it brought Eleanor a modest income and a growing reputation. She began to receive letters from women in other parishes, asking for advice, requesting copies of her other pamphlets, and sharing their own stories. Eleanor answered each letter personally, taking care to respond with warmth and respect. She also began to note that some of her correspondents were women who had been trained as midwives or apothecaries in their own right, and who had been similarly excluded from the guilds. She realized that she was not alone. She was part of a network, a hidden community of female practitioners who were quietly making a difference in their communities. Now, let us return to Grindle's shop, where Eleanor continues to work, though her role has subtly shifted. She is no longer just an assistant. She is a partner, an advisor, a woman with her own following. Grindle, who has read her pamphlets and seen her reputation grow, has begun to treat her with a new respect. He no longer asks her to sweep the floor or wash the jars. He asks her to compound the medicines, to advise the customers, to manage the inventory. He has also begun to pay her a more generous wage, though he still stops short of giving her a formal title or a share of the profits. Eleanor does not push. She is patient, knowing that her time will come. But there is a tension in this new arrangement, a subtle shifting of power that Grindle has not fully acknowledged. Eleanor now commands her own clientele, and some of those clients prefer her to Grindle. They come to the shop asking specifically for the widow, and they are often disappointed if she is not available. Grindle notices this, and he feels a faint prickling of jealousy, though he would never admit it. He has been the master of this shop for 40 years, and he is not accustomed to sharing the spotlight. But he also knows that Eleanor is good for business, that her presence attracts more customers than it loses, and that she is too valuable to alienate. So he swallows his pride, and he continues to work alongside her, an uneasy alliance of convenience. Eleanor, for her part, is aware of the shifting dynamics. She knows that Grindle is not entirely comfortable with her growing independence, but she also knows that he needs her. She uses this leverage carefully, never pushing too hard, never demanding too much. She asks for small concessions, a better workbench, a more comfortable stool, the right to take on a few extra patients, and she receives them. She is playing a long game, and she is willing to wait for the right moment to make her next move. And as she works, grinding the herbs and weighing the powders, she thinks about the future. She imagines a day when she will have her own shop, her own sign, her own name over the door. She imagines a day when women will be admitted to the guilds as a matter of course, when their skills will be recognized and their contributions valued. She knows that day may not come in her lifetime, but she is content to be a part of the struggle, a seed planted in the soil of history. Her children will carry on her work. Her pamphlets will spread her knowledge. Her reputation will outlast her. She will not be forgotten, even if her name never appears in the official records of the Worshipful Society. As you, dear listener, let these thoughts settle into your mind. Consider the quiet courage of Eleanor Slaughter. She is not a revolutionary. She is not a hero. She is a woman who refused to accept the limits that the world had placed upon her. She worked, she learned, she taught, and she persevered. Her story is not a dramatic one, but it is a deeply human one, a testament to the resilience of the spirit. And as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you will think of the women like her, the hidden hands, and the quiet hearts who have shaped the world in ways that we are only beginning to understand. Section 3. The Legacy of the Unlicensed Healer. The years that followed Eleanor Slaughter's failed petition to the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries were not years of bitterness or defeat. They were years of quiet, steady growth, like the slow expansion of a root beneath the soil. She did not abandon her ambition, but she refined it, shaping it into something more practical and more personal. She realized, with a clarity that came from years of patient observation, that the guild's approval was not the only measure of success, nor even the most important one. The true measure of her work lay in the faces of the women and children she had helped, in the letters of gratitude she received, and the whispered thanks of a mother whose feverish child had recovered. That was her guild, her certificate, her legacy. And so she continued her work with renewed purpose, not seeking the approval of the men in their velvet robes, but seeking the trust of the women who needed her. The spring of 1756 brought an unexpected challenge that would test Eleanor's skills and her reputation. A mysterious fever began to sweep through the poorer districts of London, affecting primarily the young and the elderly. It was not the plague, it was something milder, but still dangerous. A persistent, relapsing fever that left its victims weak, dehydrated, and prone to secondary infections. The physicians were baffled. They bled their patients, purged them, and applied leeches, but the fever persisted. The apothecaries, including Grindal, were kept busy dispensing their standard remedies: bark, rhubarb, and the occasional opiate, but nothing seemed to stem the tide. Eleanor, however, noticed something that the physicians had overlooked. She observed that many of the feverish patients were also suffering from a painful swelling in their gums and a looseness of their teeth. She recognized the symptoms from her reading. It was scurvy, a deficiency of fresh vegetables and fruits, often exacerbated by the cramped, damp conditions of the urban poor. She also noticed that the fever seemed to respond better to her simple herbal teas, nettle, dandelion, and watercress, than to the more drastic purges prescribed by the physicians. Armed with this observation, Eleanor began to treat her patients differently. She did not bleed them, she fed them. She prepared infusions of fresh herbs, rich in the vitamins that their diets lacked, and she added a little honey to make them palatable. She also advised her patients to eat whatever fresh greens they could find: wild garlic, young nettles, even the tender shoots of the dandelion that grew in the cracks of the pavement. She did not call this a cure. She called it nourishment, a gentle word that seemed to soothe the anxious minds of her patients. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the fever began to recede among those who followed her advice. Her patients recovered more quickly, with fewer complications, than those who had been treated by the more conventional methods. The news of Eleanor's success spread quickly through the parish. Mothers told other mothers, servants whispered to their mistresses, even a few of the physicians, grudgingly, admitted that the widow's approach seemed to produce better results. Grindal, who had initially been skeptical, began to observe the difference in his own customers. Those who had followed Eleanor's advice were returning to their normal routines more quickly than those who had relied solely on his standard drafts. He did not fully understand the science behind her approach. The concept of vitamins was still a century away, but he could not argue with the results. He began to recommend her herbal infusions to his own patients, giving her credit for the innovation. It was a small gesture, but it signaled a shift in their relationship, a recognition that Eleanor was not just an assistant, but a healer in her own right. Let us visit Eleanor in the midst of this epidemic, on a busy afternoon when the shop is crowded with patients waiting for their remedies. She is working alongside Grindal, her hands moving quickly and precisely, measuring out the dried nettles, the powdered rose hips, the crushed dandelion root. She is tired, but she does not show it. Her voice is calm, her manner reassuring. She speaks to each patient as if they were the most important person in the world, asking about their symptoms, their diet, their living conditions. She does not simply dispense a remedy. She dispenses a sense of care, a feeling of being heard and understood. This is her gift, and it is as potent as any tincture. One of the patients is a young man named William, a porter who has been struggling with the fever for nearly 2 weeks. He is pale, weak, and unable to work, and he has come to the shop as a last resort. He has been bled by a physician, and he has taken Grindal's rhubarb powder, but nothing has helped. Eleanor listens to his story, notices the pallor of his gums, and asks him what he has been eating. He admits that he has barely eaten at all, living on bread and weak beer. She prepares a strong infusion of nettle and watercress, adds a generous spoonful of honey, and tells him to drink it slowly. She also gives him a small packet of dried rose hips and instructs him to make a tea with it, drinking a cup every morning. She tells him to eat whatever greens he can find and to rest as much as his circumstances permit. William looks at her with a mixture of skepticism and hope. He has heard so many promises, and he has been disappointed so many times. But there is something in Eleanor's voice, a quiet certainty, that makes him willing to try. A week later, William returns to the shop. He is not fully recovered, but he is visibly better. His color has improved. His energy has returned, and his gums are no longer bleeding. He thanks Eleanor, not with grand words, but with a simple, heartfelt gesture. He takes off his cap and bows his head. Eleanor smiles, and she tells him to continue with the tea and to eat well. He leaves, and she feels a familiar sense of fulfillment, a quiet satisfaction that she has done her job well. The epidemic eventually subsides, as all epidemics do, and life returns to its normal rhythm. But Eleanor's reputation has been transformed. She is no longer the widow or the assistant. She is the healer, a woman who knows what she is doing, a woman who can be trusted in times of crisis. She begins to receive requests for her services from beyond the parish, from neighboring districts, and even from a few wealthier households who have heard of her success. She does not seek these requests. They come to her, carried by the invisible tide of word of mouth. She accepts them cautiously, not wanting to overextend herself, but also recognizing that this is the opportunity she has been waiting for. Now, let us consider the long-term implications of Eleanor's work. She has not achieved formal recognition from the guild, but she has achieved something far more durable. She has built a practice that is rooted in the trust of her community. She has also begun to train her daughter, Mary, who has shown a keen interest in the trade. Mary is 16, quick-witted, and observant, and she has already learned to identify most of the common herbs and to command simple remedies. Eleanor does not want Mary to face the same obstacles she has faced. She wants her daughter to have a better path, a more recognized role. And so, she begins to write a series of more ambitious pamphlets, intended not just for the general public, but for the apothecaries themselves. She writes about the treatment of scurvy, the benefits of herbal infusions, and the importance of diet in preventing disease. She does not challenge the guild directly. She simply presents her findings with the quiet confidence of a practitioner who has seen what works. The pamphlets are published anonymously, but the authorship is an open secret. They are read by physicians, by apothecaries, and by a few progressive members of the society who are beginning to question the old dogmas. A prominent physician, Dr. Samuel Fothergill, even writes a letter praising the pamphlets, noting that they contain much useful and practical knowledge. He does not know the identity of the author, but he suspects it is a woman, and he does not seem to mind. His letter is published in a medical journal, and it brings Eleanor's work to the attention of a wider audience. For the first time, her ideas are being discussed in the very circles that had rejected her. Eleanor does not let the recognition go to her head. She continues her work, day after day, with the same steady dedication that has always defined her. She also continues to petition the guild, not with the expectation of immediate success, but with the determination to keep the issue alive. She writes letters, attends public meetings, and speaks to anyone who will listen. She is not a revolutionary. She is a persistent, patient advocate for the rights of women in the medical trades. She knows that change will not come overnight, but she is willing to be a part of the slow, incremental process that will eventually bring it about. In her final years, Eleanor looks back on her life with a quiet sense of accomplishment. She has raised her children, built a practice, and trained her daughter. She has written pamphlets that have been read and respected. She has treated thousands of patients, and she has never lost a patient to negligence or ignorance. She has not achieved the formal recognition she once sought, but she has achieved something perhaps more valuable. She has lived a life of meaning, a life of meaning, a life that has made a tangible difference in the lives of others. She has also made her peace with the guild, not because they have accepted her, but because she has learned that their approval is not necessary for her own sense of worth. Let us visit Eleanor on a quiet summer evening, in her small room above the chandler's shop. She is old now, her hair white, her face lined with the traces of a long and eventful life. She is sitting by the window, looking out at the rooftops, her hands resting in her lap. Her daughter Mary is beside her, reading aloud from one of the pamphlets, the one on scurvy, which has become a small classic in its own right. Mary's voice is clear and steady, and she reads with the confidence of a woman who knows her craft. Eleanor listens, and she feels a profound sense of peace. She knows that her work will continue, that Mary will carry it on, that the tradition of female healing will endure. The guilds may ignore it, but the people will remember. As the sun sets over the London rooftops, Eleanor closes her eyes and allows herself a moment of reflection. She thinks about her husband, lost at sea so many years ago. She thinks about the children she has raised. She thinks about the patients she has treated. She also thinks about the women who came before her. The wise women, the midwives, the herbalists, who had no guilds, no certificates, no formal recognition, but who healed nonetheless. She is part of that tradition, a link in a long, unbroken chain. And she knows, with the quiet certainty that comes from a life well lived, that her place in that chain is secure. The world does not need to know her name. The world needs to know her work. And that work, she knows, will outlast her. Now, as you listen to this story, dear listener, consider the quiet legacy of Eleanor Slaughter. She is not a famous figure. She is not remembered in the history books. She is not honored by any guild or society. But she is remembered by the families she helped, the women she empowered, and the daughter she trained. Her legacy is not one of titles or honors, but of human connection, of small acts of kindness that ripple outward through time. She reminds us that the most important work is often the least visible, the most humble, the most ordinary. And as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you will think of the women like her in your own life, the quiet healers who have made a difference without seeking recognition. Perhaps you will give them a moment of silent thanks, for they are the true keepers of the tradition of care. Story 5. The Final Mortar. How the Trade Paved the Way for Modern Pharmacies. Section 1. The Gathering Storm of Change. The year was 1772, and Thomas Grindal was dead. He had passed quietly in his sleep, at the age of 73, surrounded by the familiar scents of his shop. The lavender, the camphor, the faint, sweet undertone of honey that had always clung to his clothes. His son, young Thomas, had taken over the business, but he had inherited neither his father's steady hands nor his quiet patience. He was a man of a new generation, restless, ambitious, and increasingly frustrated by the limitations of the old trade. He had grown up in the shop, had learned the recipes, had weighed the powders, but he had also read the new pamphlets, attended the new lectures, and heard the whispers of a coming transformation that would sweep away the old ways like a spring tide. He looked at his father's shelves, at the rows of dried herbs and the jars of lozenges, and he saw not a legacy, but a relic. The world was changing, and Grindal's shop, with its brass scales and its copper pans, was in danger of being left behind. The young Thomas was not alone in his restlessness. Across London, and indeed across England, a new generation of apothecaries was beginning to question the old certainties. They had been trained in the traditional methods, but they had also been exposed to the new ideas that were bubbling up from the universities, the scientific societies, and the growing network of medical schools. They had read the works of Barhave and Cullen, had heard of the experiments of Lavoisier and Priestley, and had begun to wonder if the humoral theory, which had dominated medicine for 2,000 years, was nothing more than an elaborate superstition. They were not revolutionaries. They were pragmatists, men who wanted to heal their patients more effectively, and who were willing to abandon old doctrines if they did not work. But the transformation was not just intellectual, it was also commercial. The old guild system, with its rigid hierarchies and its exclusive privileges, was beginning to creak under the pressure of a growing population and a more competitive marketplace. The street sellers, like Jeremiah Spatchcock, were still thriving, offering cheap remedies to the poor, and they were being joined by a new class of druggists and chemists who sold their wares without any guild license. These newcomers were not quacks. They were often well-trained, knowledgeable, and commercially savvy. They had no loyalty to the worshipful society of apothecaries, and they were undercutting the guild members' prices, attracting customers with their lower costs and their more modern methods. The society, which had once been the undisputed regulator of the apothecary trade, was now struggling to maintain its authority. Young Thomas Grindal was caught in the middle of this transformation. He had inherited his father's guild membership, his shop, his reputation, and his customers. But he had also inherited his father's debts, his outdated equipment, and his old-fashioned recipes. He knew that he needed to modernize, to adopt the new chemistry, to offer his customers something that the druggists could not match. But he also knew that the guild was watching him, and that any deviation from the traditional methods could result in fines, censure, or even expulsion. He was a man pulled in two directions, and he had not yet found a way to reconcile the conflicting demands of tradition and innovation. Let us walk with young Thomas through his shop on a bleak November morning, just as the first frost is settling on the cobblestones. He is dressed in a sober black coat, not the linen apron of his father, and he is standing behind the counter, studying a new shipment of chemicals that he has ordered from a supplier in France. The shipment contains several bottles of fixed alkali, a substance that he has read about in the new chemical texts, and which he believes could be used to create more effective antacids and digestive remedies. He is excited by the possibilities, but he is also nervous. He has not told the guild about this purchase. He is not sure if they would approve. He sets the bottles on the shelf, next to the jars of dried rhubarb, and he feels a small thrill of defiance. He is stepping into a new world, and he is determined to make his mark. Now, let us consider the broader context of this transformation. The 1770s and 1780s were a period of intense scientific ferment. The old alchemical traditions were being replaced by a new, more rigorous chemistry based on measurement, experimentation, and the careful analysis of substances. The discovery of gases, oxygen, hydrogen, carbon dioxide, was revolutionizing the understanding of combustion, respiration, and even disease. The old humoral theory was being challenged by new theories of nervous energy, tissue function, and cellular organization. Physicians and apothecaries alike were being forced to rethink their assumptions, to abandon the ancient texts, and to embrace the new knowledge. It was an exciting time, but it was also a confusing and unsettling time, full of conflicting claims and uncertain certainties. Young Thomas Grindle was not a scientist. He was a tradesman, and his interest in the new chemistry was practical rather than theoretical. He wanted to know which of the new chemicals could be used to relieve pain, to settle stomachs, to cure fevers. He wanted to know which of the old remedies could be improved, simplified, or replaced. He wanted to offer his customers something that was both effective and affordable, something that would keep them coming back to his shop rather than to the druggist down the street. He was, in his own way, a pragmatist, a man who was willing to embrace change if it brought tangible benefits. But the guild was not ready for this kind of pragmatism. The Worshipful Society of Apothecaries had been founded to regulate the trade, to protect the public from unsafe remedies, and to maintain the standards of the profession. Its members were proud of their history, their traditions, and their exclusive privileges. They saw the new chemistry as a threat, a challenge to their authority, a dangerous innovation that could lead to chaos and charlatanism. They resisted change, they clung to the old methods, and they viewed men like young Thomas with suspicion. They were not foolish. They were simply cautious, and their caution was born of a genuine concern for the safety of the public. But their caution, in the face of rapid change, was beginning to look like obstructionism. Let us sit with young Thomas as he writes a letter to the society requesting permission to offer a new remedy, a soda powder that he has developed using the fixed alkali from France. The remedy is simple, a mixture of sodium bicarbonate and tartaric acid, which, when dissolved in water, produces a gentle effervescence that can soothe an upset stomach. It is not a dramatic cure, but it is a practical one, and Thomas believes it will be popular with his customers. He writes the letter carefully, explaining the composition of the powder, the method of preparation, and the intended use. He also includes a small sample, neatly wrapped, and he sends the letter by messenger. He waits for a reply, his heart heavy with a mixture of hope and dread. The reply, when it comes, is disappointing. The society acknowledges receipt of his letter and his sample, but it informs him that the use of chemical preparations in the apothecary trade is not consistent with the established practices of the society. The letter does not it simply states that the society will not endorse it, and that any complaints or adverse reactions will be his own responsibility. The message is clear. If Thomas wants to innovate, he must do so without the backing of the guild. He must accept the risks of failure, the possibility of legal liability, and the potential damage to his reputation. The society will not help him, but it will not society him. He is on his own. Thomas reads the letter several times, and he feels a complex mixture of emotions. He is relieved that the society has not forbidden his experiment, but he is also disappointed that they have not offered their support. He is angry at their stubbornness, but he also understands their caution. He is determined to proceed, but he is also afraid of the consequences. He sets the letter aside, and he begins to prepare his first batch of soda powder. He measures the ingredients carefully, mixes them thoroughly, and packs them into small, sealed packets. He labels each packet with the name of the remedy and a brief description of its use. He places them in a prominent position on his counter, and he waits for his customers to notice. The first few weeks are slow. The customers are hesitant. They are used to the old remedies, the familiar herbs and powders, and they are not sure what to make of this new fizzy powder. But Thomas is patient, and he offers free samples to a few trusted custard customers. They try the powder, find that it works, and tell their friends. Word spreads, slowly but steadily, and soon the soda powder is selling well. Thomas feels a small, quiet triumph. He has done something new, something modern, and it has worked. He has proven that the old ways are not the only ways, that innovation is possible, even within the constraints of a traditional trade. The success of the soda powder is a turning point for Thomas. He begins to experiment with other new remedies, using the chemical knowledge that he has acquired from his reading. He develops a gentle laxative using magnesium hydroxide, a soothing balm using zinc oxide, and a mild antiseptic using boric acid. Each new remedy is carefully tested, carefully packaged, and carefully sold. Each one brings in a small profit and a small increment of reputation. Thomas is no longer just an apothecary. He is a chemist, a modern practitioner, a man who is helping to shape the future of his profession. But the transformation is not without its costs. Thomas has alienated some of his older customers, who prefer the old remedies and distrust the new chemicals. He has also alienated some of his guild colleagues, who see his experiments as a betrayal of the old traditions. He has lost a few friends and made a few enemies. But he has also gained a new generation of customers, younger, more open-minded, more willing to embrace the new science. He has also gained a new sense of purpose, a conviction that he is on the right path, that he is part of something larger than himself. As Thomas closes his shop on a cold December evening, he looks at his shelves. The old jars of dried herbs next to the new bottles of chemicals, and he realizes that he is standing at a crossroads. The old trade, the trade of his father and his grandfather, is dying. The new trade, the trade of the chemist and the druggist, is being born. He is caught between the two, not fully belonging to either, but also playing a crucial role in the transition. He is not a revolutionary. He is a bridge, a man who spans the gap between the old and the new, who carries the knowledge of the past into the uncertain future. And as he climbs the stairs to his living quarters, he thinks about his father, old Thomas Grindle, who had worked so patiently in this very shop for 40 years. He wonders what his father would think of the soda powder, the fixed alkali, the new chemicals. He suspects that his father would be wary, would caution him to be careful, would urge him not to abandon the old wisdom too quickly. But he also suspects that his father would, in the end, approve. His father had been a pragmatist, a man who trusted results more than theories. He had adopted the domestic rhubarb, the sugar lozenges, the gentle remedies. He had been, in his own quiet way, an innovator. Young Thomas is simply continuing that tradition, carrying it forward into a new era. He is honoring his father not by preserving the old shop exactly as it was, but by adapting it to the needs of the present. The question that lingers, as Thomas settles into his bed and listens to the wind rattling the shutters, is this: where does this path lead? The new chemistry is changing everything. The remedies, the trade, the very definition of what it means to be an apothecary. The guilds are struggling to maintain their authority. The physicians are grappling with new theories, and the public is being offered more choices than ever before. The future is uncertain, full of possibility and peril. But Thomas is not afraid. He is curious. He wants to see where this road leads, and he is willing to walk it, one step at a time. And as you, dear listener, drift towards sleep, you might ask yourself the same question. Where does this path lead? The apothecaries of the 18th century, with their lozenges and their tinctures, were the predecessors of the modern pharmacists, the chemists, the drug manufacturers. The slow, patient work of men like Grindal and women like Eleanor laid the foundations for the medical world we know today. The bitter roots became gentle staples. The guilds gave way to professional organizations. The old humoral theory was replaced by modern pharmacology. The transformation was slow, uneven, and often contested, but it happened. And in that transformation, there is a lesson for all of us that the future is built not by dramatic revolutions, but by the quiet, persistent work of ordinary people who do their jobs, help their neighbors, and keep their faith in the power of healing. Section 2. The chemist's new clothes. The winter of 1772 gave way to a spring that seemed to bring not just warmer weather, but a palpable shift in the very air of London. Young Thomas Grindal had weathered the initial skepticism surrounding his soda powder, and he had emerged not only unscathed but emboldened. He had discovered something that his father had never fully grasped, that the public, once given a taste of something new and effective, would embrace it with surprising enthusiasm. The soda powder was selling briskly, and Thomas had begun to experiment with other chemical preparations. A mild sedative using bromide, a gentle stimulant using caffeine extracted from coffee beans, and a soothing ointment using zinc oxide. Each new product was a small step away from the old herbal traditions and a small step toward the modern pharmacy that was beginning to take shape in his imagination. But Thomas was not the only one experimenting. Across the city, a new breed of practitioner was emerging. Men who called themselves chemists rather than apothecaries, who wore not the linen aprons of the old trade, but the dark frock coats of the new science. They set up shops that looked more like laboratories than like the cluttered, herb-scented spaces of the old apothecaries. Their shelves were lined not with jars of dried roots and leaves, but with bottles of clear liquids, labeled in neat, copperplate script, Satum sulfuricum, aqua ammoniae, spiritus vini rectificatus. They sold their wares to a growing clientele of physicians, surgeons, and hospitals, and they also sold directly to the public, offering remedies that were cheaper and often more potent than the traditional preparations. They were not guild members. They did not seek the approval of the worshipful society of apothecaries. They were outside the system, and they were thriving. Thomas watched this new breed with a mixture of envy and admiration. He wanted to be like them, to embrace the new science fully, to leave behind the old trappings of the guild and the herbal tradition. But he was also his father's son, and he could not simply abandon the shop, the customers, the reputation that had been built over decades. He was caught, as so many are, between the past and the future, unable to fully commit to either. He decided, with the pragmatism that he had inherited from his father, to chart a middle course. He would not abandon the old remedies. He would supplement them with the new. He would not reject the guild. He would work within it, slowly pushing it toward reform. He would not become a chemist overnight. He would become a hybrid, an apothecary chemist, a man of both worlds. Let us visit Thomas on a bright May morning, as he is preparing a new batch of his soda powder. He works in the back room of the shop, where the old copper pans still hang on the wall, but where he has also installed a new piece of equipment, a small brass distillation apparatus which he uses to purify his chemicals. The room is filled with the familiar scents of herbs, but also with the sharper, more acrid smells of the new chemistry, sulfur, ammonia, and the faint, sweetish odor of ether. Thomas moves between the old and the new with an ease that would have astonished his father. He grinds a handful of dried peppermint leaves in the old mortar, then measures out a precise quantity of sodium bicarbonate using a new, delicate scale that he has imported from France. He is a man in transition, and his shop is a symbol of that transition. Now, let us consider the wider implications of this transition. The old apothecary trade had been based on a simple premise that the natural world contained remedies for all diseases, and that the apothecary's job was to prepare those remedies in a consistent and reliable manner. The new chemistry challenged that premise, arguing that many natural remedies were ineffective, that some were even harmful, and that the future of medicine lay in the synthesis of new compounds that could be precisely controlled and standardized. The chemists were not rejecting nature. They were seeking to improve upon it, to create remedies that were more potent, more predictable, and more affordable. It was a vision that appealed to the growing commercial spirit of the age, and it was a vision that threatened to make the old apothecaries obsolete. The worshipful society of apothecaries, which had once been the unquestioned arbiter of the trade, found itself increasingly marginalized. Its members were divided. Some, like young Thomas, wanted to embrace the new chemistry and reform the guild from within. Others wanted to resist the change, to preserve the old traditions and the old privileges. The society was paralyzed by its internal divisions, unable to adapt to the changing times. Its membership began to decline, as younger apothecaries left to become chemists, and as older ones retired or died. The society's authority, once absolute, was now being challenged on all sides. Let us attend a meeting of the society on a warm evening in June at their hall near the Strand. The room is oak-panelled, lit by candles, and filled with the low murmur of conversation. The members are dressed in their formal black coats and white cravats, and they are debating a proposal that has been put forward by a young, reform-minded member. The proposal is simple: that the society should begin to offer training in chemistry to its apprentices, alongside the traditional training in herbal medicine. The proposal is not radical. It is a modest attempt to adapt to the changing times. But it is met with fierce opposition from the older members, who see it as a betrayal of the society's founding principles. They argue that chemistry is a dangerous and untested science, that it will lead to the proliferation of unsafe remedies, and that it will undermine the reputation of the apothecary trade. The debate rages for hours, and in the end, the proposal is defeated by a narrow margin. The older members have won, but their victory is hollow. They have preserved the old ways, but they have also ensured that the society will continue to decline. Thomas, who is present at the meeting, feels a familiar sense of frustration. He has seen the future, and he knows that the society is on the wrong side of history. He also knows that he cannot wait for the society to change. He must change on his own. He decides, in that moment, to take a step that he has been contemplating for months. He will open a second shop, a chemical dispensary, in a different part of London, where he will sell his new remedies without the constraints of the guild. He will not leave the society. He will simply expand his practice, creating a space where the old and the new can coexist. It is a risky move, but he is willing to take the risk in it. He has faith in his products, faith in his customers, and faith in his own abilities. The new shop, which opens in the autumn of 1774, is a modest affair. A single room, fitted with shelves and a counter located on a busy street near the river. It is not as grand as his father's shop, but it is bright, clean, and modern. The shelves are lined with bottles of chemicals, neatly labeled and carefully arranged. The counter is made of polished wood, and there is a small brass scale for weighing out precise doses. Thomas stands behind the counter, dressed in his dark frock coat, and he welcomes his first customers with a quiet smile. They are not the same customers who visit his father's shop. They are younger, more adventurous, more willing to try something new. They ask for the soda powder, the bromide sedative, the caffeine tonic, and they are satisfied with the results. The new shop is a success, but it is also a source of tension. The older members of the guild are displeased. They see the shop as a betrayal, a violation of the unwritten rules of the trade. A few of them refuse to speak to Thomas, and one of them even threatens to report him to the society. But Thomas is undeterred. He knows that he is not breaking any law, only challenging a custom. He continues his work, quietly and steadily, and he watches as the new shop gradually attracts a loyal clientele. He is building something new, something that will outlast the old guild and its fading authority. Now, let us step back and consider the larger significance of Thomas's experiment. He is not just an apothecary. He is a pioneer, a man who is helping to shape the future of his profession. The chemical dispensary that he has founded is a precursor to the modern pharmacy, a place where medicines are prepared not from dried herbs, but from standardized chemicals. The shift is slow, but it is irreversible. The old ways are fading, and the new ways are taking their place. Thomas is not a revolutionary. He is a catalyst, a man who accelerates a change that is already underway. As Thomas closes his new shop on a cold November evening, he reflects on the journey that has brought him here. He thinks about his father, old Thomas Grindle, who had worked so patiently in the old shop, who had grown his own rhubarb and made his own lozenges. He thinks about Eleanor Slaughter, the widow who had defied the guild and built her own practice. He thinks about the street sellers, the quacks, the chemists, all the men and women who have contributed to the slow, messy evolution of the trade. He feels a deep sense of gratitude for all of them, and he also feels a deep sense of responsibility. He is carrying their legacy forward, and he knows that he must do it well. There is a question that lingers as Thomas walks home through the foggy streets, a question that he cannot quite answer. Where does this path lead? The new chemistry is transforming medicine, but it is also creating new risks. The risk of poisoning, the risk of unintended side effects, the risk of commercial exploitation. The old remedies were not always effective, but they were usually safe. The new chemicals are more potent, but they are also more dangerous. Thomas knows that he must be careful, that he must test his products thoroughly, that he must be honest with his customers about the risks and the benefits. He must be a healer, not just a merchant. He must maintain the ethical standards of his father, even as he embraces the methods of the new science. And as you, dear listener, drift towards sleep, you might ask yourself the same question. Where does this path lead? The world of medicine is always changing, always evolving, always caught between the old and the new. The apothecaries of the 18th century, with their lozenges and their tinctures, were the bridge between the ancient traditions and the modern pharmacy. They were not perfect, but they were human, and they did their best. Their legacy is not just in the medicines they made, but in the spirit of care and compassion that guided their work. That legacy lives on in the pharmacists and doctors of today who continue to heal, to comfort, and to care for the sick. Section 3. The legacy of the glass bottle. The years that followed the opening of Thomas Grindle's chemical dispensary were years of quiet consolidation, of slow but steady growth, of the gradual acceptance of the new ways by a public that had once been skeptical. By 1780, Thomas had become a respected figure in both the old world of the apothecaries and the new world of the chemists. He had maintained his membership in the Worshipful Society, though he had ceased to attend its meetings regularly, finding them increasingly irrelevant to his daily work. He had also built a thriving practice, serving a diverse clientele that ranged from wealthy merchants seeking his bromide sedatives to poor laborers who could afford his simple, effective remedies. He had become, in the words of one satisfied customer, a man who knows his powders from his potions, and his potions. But Thomas was not content to rest on his achievements. He had inherited his father's restless curiosity, his mother's quiet determination, and he was always looking for ways to improve his craft. He continued to read the new chemical texts, to correspond with other practitioners, and to experiment with new preparations. He developed a gentle antiseptic using a solution of chlorinated lime, which he found to be remarkably effective in treating wounds and preventing infection. He also developed a soothing syrup using a combination of codeine and ipecacuanha, which he used to treat persistent coughs and respiratory ailments. Each new remedy was a small step forward, a tiny contribution to the growing body of medical knowledge. Let us visit Thomas on a summer afternoon. In the year 70, the room is bright and airy, with large windows that let in the warm sunlight. The shelves are filled with glass bottles, neatly labeled, and the air is filled with the clean, sharp scent of alcohol and essential oils. Thomas is wearing a clean white apron, not the stained linen of the old trade, and he is using a new piece of equipment, a small, hand-operated press that he uses to extract oils from seeds and herbs. He is working on a new preparation, a tincture of digital ice, which he has read about in a French medical journal. He is cautious, as always, because he knows that digital ice is a powerful cardiac stimulant and that a slight overdose could be fatal. But he is also curious because he has heard that the tincture can be remarkably effective in treating dropsy, a condition that has long baffled physicians. Thomas's caution is a hallmark of his practice. He has seen too many patients harmed by careless dosing, too many remedies that were more dangerous than the diseases they were meant to cure. He is determined to be a healer, not a killer, and he takes great care to test his new remedies on himself before offering them to his customers. He has a small notebook, bound in leather, in which he records his observations, the dosage, the effects, the side effects, and he consults it regularly. He is, in his own way, a scientist, a man who believes in evidence and careful observation. He is also, in his own way, a healer, a man who believes in compassion and the alleviation of suffering. Now, let us consider the broader changes that are taking place in the world of medicine. The old humoral theory, which had dominated medical thought for 2,000 years, is finally beginning to crumble. The new chemistry, with its emphasis on precise measurement and controlled experimentation, is providing a more reliable foundation for medical practice. The physicians are beginning to adopt the new methods, though slowly and unevenly. The apothecaries are becoming more like chemists, dispensing standardized remedies rather than the variable preparations of the old herbal tradition. The hospitals are adopting new sanitation practices, reducing the risk of infection and improving the survival rates of their patients. The world of medicine is being transformed, and the transformation is being driven by the same forces that are transforming the broader society: commerce, science, and the relentless pursuit of progress. But there is a shadow to this progress, a cost that is often overlooked. The new medicines, for all their efficacy, are also more dangerous. The old herbal remedies were usually safe, even if they were often ineffective. The new chemical remedies are potent, but they can also be deadly. The apothecaries and chemists who dispense them must be more careful, more knowledgeable, more responsible than their predecessors. They must understand not just the properties of the chemicals they are dispensing, but also the potential interactions, the side effects, the contraindications. They must be, in short, professionals. And professionalism, with its demands for training, certification, and regulation, is a heavy burden. It excludes the poor, the uneducated, the women who had once found a place in the old trade. It creates hierarchies and exclusions that are as rigid as those of the old guilds. The new pharmacy, for all its benefits, is not a utopia. It is a new set of problems. Thomas is aware of this shadow. He has seen how the new regulations have made it harder for women like Eleanor Slaughter to practice, how the requirement for formal training has excluded the poor and the self-taught. He has also seen how the commercial pressures of the new trade have led some practitioners to cut corners, to sell dangerous remedies, to prioritize profit over safety. He is not naive. He knows that the new system is not perfect. But he also knows that it is better than the old system, that it offers more effective treatments, that it provides a more reliable foundation for the healing arts. He is a pragmatist, and he accepts the imperfections of the present while working to improve them for the future. Let us sit with Thomas in the evening, after he has closed his shop. He is sitting in his small study, surrounded by books and papers, writing in his notebook. He is recording the results of his digitalized experiment, noting that the tincture has been effective in treating a patient with dropsy, but that it must be used with extreme caution. He writes carefully, legibly, knowing that his notes may be read by other practitioners, that they may contribute to the growing body of medical knowledge. He is not writing for fame or fortune. He is writing for the sake of the craft, for the sake of the patients who will come after him. He is a humble man, but he is also a man who knows the value of his work. As he closes his notebook and prepares for bed, Thomas thinks about the legacy he will leave behind. He has no sons of his own. His wife died young, and he never remarried. But he has trained several apprentices, young men who have gone on to establish their own practices. He has also written a small book, a guide to the preparation and dispensing of chemical remedies, which he hopes will be useful to other practitioners. He has built a practice, a reputation, a body of knowledge. He has done what he can with what he has, and he is content with the result. But there is one more thread to this story, a thread that connects Thomas's work to the broader tapestry of history. In the years after his death, the chemical dispensary that he founded will be joined by others, and together they will form the basis of a new profession. The profession of the old apothecaries, with their herbs and their lozenges, will fade away, replaced by chemists and druggists and pharmacists. The guilds, with their rigid hierarchies and their exclusive privileges, will give way to professional organizations and regulatory bodies. The medicines will become more standardized, more effective, and more accessible. The world of medicine will be transformed, and the transformation will be built on the foundations laid by men like Thomas Grindal. And yet, something will be lost in the transition. The old trade, with its intimacy, its connection to the natural world, its willingness to adapt to the needs of the poor, will disappear. The new pharmacy will be more efficient, but it will also be more impersonal. The patient will become a customer, the remedy a product, the healer a merchant. The human connection, so central to the work of the old apothecaries, will be attenuated, sometimes lost entirely. Thomas would understand this. He would mourn it, even as he accepted it as inevitable. Now, let us return to the shop, the old shop, the one that Thomas inherited from his father, the one that still stands on the corner of the narrow London street. It is now the year 1790, and Thomas is an old man, his hair white, his hands trembling slightly. He is sitting behind the counter, not because he is working, but because he likes to be near the familiar objects, the brass scales, the copper pans, the jars of dried herbs that still line the shelves. He is thinking about his father, old Thomas Grindal, who had worked so patiently in this very space. He is thinking about Eleanor Slaughter, the widow who had defied the guild. He is thinking about the street sellers, the quacks, the chemists, all the men and women who have shaped the trade. He is thinking about the long journey of the rhubarb route, from the Tibetan plateau to his own backyard. He is thinking about the lozenges, the powders, the tinctures, the syrups. He is thinking about the thousands of patients he has treated, the thousands of lives he has touched, the thousands of small, quiet acts of healing that have defined his life. He is thinking, too, about the future. He knows that the shop will not survive him. His apprentices have moved on, his family has scattered. He knows that the building will be torn down, or converted, or sold. He knows that the old ways will fade, replaced by the new. He knows that the world of medicine will continue to change, in ways that he cannot imagine. And yet, he feels a sense of peace, sense of completion. He has carried the torch as far as he could. He has passed it on to others, who will carry it further. As you, dear listener, drift toward the final moments of this long, gentle narrative, consider the legacy of the apothecaries. They were not saints, not heroes, not geniuses. They were ordinary men and women, doing their best in a world that was often difficult and unfair. They made mistakes. They had flaws. They were sometimes greedy and sometimes foolish. But they also cared for the sick, comforted the dying, and brought a little sweetness into a bitter world. They were the bridge between the ancient traditions and the modern pharmacy, the link between the past and the future. Their legacy is not in the medicines they made, but in the spirit of care that guided their work. That spirit, gentle and persistent, endures. It lives on in the pharmacists, the doctors, the nurses, the healers of today. It lives on in the quiet, unheralded acts of compassion that still take place in hospitals, in clinics, in the homes of the sick. It is a small flame, but it is a steady one, and it will never be extinguished. And so, we come to the end of our stories. We have traveled through the world of the 18th century apothecaries, from the candy-like cures to the bitter rhubarb, from the street sellers to the guild meetings, from the hidden hands of the widows to the bright glass bottles of the new chemistry. We have seen the slow, patient transformation of a trade, the quiet evolution of a profession, the steady march of progress. We have met ordinary people, extraordinary in their ordinariness, who did their work with diligence and compassion. We have learned that history is not made by kings and generals, but by the quiet labors of the many. We have learned that healing is not just a science, but an art, a craft, a calling. We have learned that the past is not a distant, foreign land, but a place that lives on in the present, in the medicines we take, the remedies we trust, the care we give and receive. As you close your eyes and let the gentle rhythms of this narrative carry you towards sleep, remember the apothecaries. Remember their lozenges and their tinctures. Remember their scales and their mortars. Remember their patience and their persistence. And know that you too are part of this story, part of the long, unbroken chain of Pen. You are the heir to their legacy, the keeper of their flame. May you carry it forward with the same gentle humor, the same quiet determination, the same unwavering compassion that guided them. Sleep well, and dream of a world where healing is always within reach, where comfort is always available, and where the small, ordinary acts of kindness are the truest medicines of all.